CD4.
Chapter 9. Patrick Christopher Shepherd was the best of us, Zoe said to herself as she walked along the path. He made me laugh every day I knew him. He made me feel loved, so loved. And being loved by him was... She hesitated, struggling for the words that adequately described her feelings. It was like standing in a pool of sunshine, feeling warmed right through. It was like winning the lottery over and over again. The eulogy was still coming together, although she had reached the point where she just liked talking about her husband, even if she was the only one there to listen. She liked the idea of him looking down on her from wherever he was and hearing her praise. Anything to try and make up for their last horrible conversation, frankly. She sighed, sinking into gloom. It wasn't as if the two of them had even really argued that much. They both had hot tempers, but weren't one of those couples forever scowling and muttering at each other, slagging each other off behind their backs. But their last minutes spent together had been in argument, and that was one of the worst things about Patrick dying. They had never been able to say sorry, never hugged each other and made up, and now they were stuck like this forever, with their cross words permanently frozen between them. She had come to the old deer park in Richmond for her morning walk today, and the grass was thick and lush after all the rain they'd had, the trees splendid with their new acid green leaves, fresh and vivid. Blackbirds pecked busily at the ground, and the air was soft and damp, just the sort to leave her hair in a total frizzball by the time she got back home. Glancing up, she noticed that the sky had become a sulky grey, dismal and dreary, and she walked a little faster, wondering if she should have brought an umbrella. It had been the longest winter of her life, and in some ways still didn't seem to be in a hurry to make way for spring. Where are the sodden butterflies anyway? She had moaned to her friend Claire 2 weeks after the funeral. Her mum and stepdad had gone back to Penarth and she didn't feel able to cope in the house alone with the kids. So Claire had camped out with her for a few nights, sharing the double bed. On this particular night they had drunk quite a lot of red wine, and Zoe had begun bemoaning the fact that everyone else, upon losing someone close, seemed to see a butterfly and take it to be a beautiful spiritual message from their loved one. "When am I going to see a butterfly?" she had wailed. In July, I should think," Claire had replied, elbowing her. "When they actually hatch? Because it's still March, remember?" Zoe had blushed, feeling foolish, but the point remained the same. She'd read and heard so many stories of mysterious messages coming from the other side, following a bereavement, signs of comfort sent to those left behind. When was Patrick going to get his arse into gear and do the same? Should she take it to mean that he didn't care? Helen Baxter from school said she kept seeing feathers when her grandfather died, she explained. Like dropped feathers on the pavement everywhere. A huge white one was even on a doormat one morning. She was convinced it was him, sending them to her. Sending her feathers? Claire, always a bit of a skeptic about anything remotely woo-woo, didn't seem to find this particularly deep and meaningful. What, you mean those things that randomly float off birds all the time? So her ghostly granddad went plucking them out deliberately for Helen, did he? And scattered them around on her doormat? Sounds a bit of a weirdo to me. I only hope the poor woman doesn't have any kind of feather allergy. Claire, it's not like that. Helen said she found it really comforting and nice, because she was so certain that they were from him. It was as if her granddad was with her again each time. Zoe had paused then, suddenly doubtful. It seemed plausible enough when Helen told her about it, but in the face of Claire's cynicism, the words didn't quite add up anymore. I wish Patrick would send me something like that. Just a sign, that he was okay. Claire raised an eyebrow. Do I really need to spell this out? The eyebrow said. Darling, he's not okay though, is he? She reminded her gently. Zoe and Claire had met at teacher training college, and Claire was a secondary school science teacher through and through, with no capacity whatsoever for entertaining bullshit. Don't say it, Zoe pleaded. Indulge me, please, Claire. They'd gone on to drink more wine, which resulted in a silly, verging on hysterical conversation about what exactly Patrick might leave for her by way of ghostly message. A pair of pliers, one of his many pairs of hated reading glasses, an odd sock, and then Zoe had started to cry because she felt sad that she had washed all of his socks now and would never find another stray one. She'd even rolled them into neat pairs and put them back in his drawer, as if waiting for the next time he'd wear them. Every time she thought about those clean, unworn socks, her heart seemed to crack all over again. Anyway, whatever Claire might say, Zoe was still looking out for her sign. How could she give up on the idea when she was desperate to be reconciled with her husband after their last argument? I forgive you, she called into the cold, hushed air in the hope that he might reciprocate somehow. Did you hear me? I forgive you. It's fine. A woman with a fuchsia woolly hat walked by just then, accompanied by a Yorkshire Terrier in a smart tartan coat, and gave Zoe an odd sort of look. The woman, that is, not the dog. Although, come to think of it, the dog had stared up at her rather quizzically too. Maybe the dog was a sign from... No, stop it. Don't go completely mad now on top of everything else, she groaned to herself. Besides, if Patrick was going to come back and give her a message as a dog, he would not choose a Yorkshire Terrier as his guise. He'd go for something infinitely more macho. A lurcher or a German shepherd. Maybe even a staffy, if the afterlife had left him feeling particularly insecure. Zoe found herself blushing at this crazy line of thought, glad that nobody could see inside her head and realise what a lunatic she had become. Pull yourself together, Zoe. Best foot forward. Your dead husband will not manifest himself as a dog. Their argument hadn't even been an especially meaningful one. They were in the kitchen together while the children were in their various rooms. It was the golden hour when she was cooking dinner and everyone was home, all safely gathered in. She was listening to a funny podcast while she diced celery and carrots. There was a bottle of rather nice-looking white wine in the fridge, and it felt cosy to be indoors with the rain pattering against the windows, the blinds pulled down against the shadows. She remembered feeling content as Patrick came in, dumping a tool bag on the floor, his hair wet from the rain. He kissed her hello, their last kiss, as it turned out, and asked about her day. Oh, if she had only known this was to be their last kiss, she would have made so much more of it. But she'd had garlic on her fingers and didn't want to get it on his shirt, so she'd gone in for more of a peck, unattached, instead of a proper full-body smooch. This was another of her enduring regrets. Then she had told him, in full cheerful detail, about the school she'd worked in that day, and how, during a creative writing session, one of the 6-year-olds had ventured a contribution to the class. A really imaginative, funny contribution at that. Afterwards, at break time, the teaching assistant Louise had told Zoe that the boy in question, Caleb, never usually spoke up in class. Never. Patrick hadn't looked quite as impressed as he might have done at the end of Zoe's little spiel of glory. He'd shrugged a shoulder, put some bread in the toaster, even though she was right there making his dinner, which would be ready in 40 minutes, and pushed his lips out in a so-what face. What's the point of it all, though? He said offhand. She should have left it then, rolled her eyes at him for bursting her bubble. But his question was so ridiculous, and she actually felt kind of aggrieved. So she went on the counterattack. "What's the point of education?" she replied scornfully. "Is that what you're saying?" "I mean, writing a story is not exactly important, is it?" God, what had put him in such a grump? He surely knew that this was a pretty big button to go pressing. "Well, it is important, actually. It's fun, for one thing. The children get to go wild with their imaginations. They create something together, as a class, so there's this lovely shared ownership and—" "Right," he said, cutting in. "But that's not going to help them in the real world, is it?" She gazed at him, stung. "It will, if my lessons make them feel validated," she answered. "It will, if it helps them work as a team and feel confident that their ideas are encouraged, rather than dismissed. I did a whole module at uni about learning through play. If kids are—" "Oh, at uni," he mocked. "I wondered when you were going to mention that. Going to university doesn't teach you everything, though, does it?" The argument seemed to be getting bigger and nastier by the second, as if it were rolling down a hill and picking up speed. This latest angle was something they touched upon before. Zoe knew that Patrick had a chip on his shoulder about university, not least because she'd gone and he hadn't. He was smart but uninterested in school, passing his exams but leaving at 16 in order to go straight into work. University of life, that's all you need, he'd claimed in the past. Whatever. "No," she said, feeling tired as she swept the chopped vegetables into the frying pan. "Going to university doesn't teach you everything, Patrick." "Waste of money, if you ask me. I'm certainly not expecting our kids to bother with that sort of thing. Get out and get working, that's what they should do. Have a bit of pride in themselves, rather than loaf around being a student." She knew he was deliberately trying to get a rise out of her, and another time she might have joked away the tension, steered the conversation to a safer zone. But he was starting to get on her nerves now. "Well, I hope our children do go to university," she said, adding a glug of olive oil to the pan and stirring everything together. "I would love them to. They're all clever enough to do whatever they want. Why would you deny them that experience?" She knew why, of course. He had confessed to her once that his worst fear was of the children growing up and moving ahead of him, intellectually. Being cleverer than him and looking down on him, their blue-collar dad with his van and toolbox. She had done her best to reassure him. Of course they wouldn't. They admire you, they love you. But already Ethan was starting to favour her when it came to asking for homework help, as if he felt that his dad wouldn't be able to guide him through whatever he was stuck on. You didn't have to be a genius to recognise that this would injure Patrick's pride. The argument had continued snippily on, and pointlessly on too, seeing as Ethan was still only 14 and hadn't even thought about his further education options. Zoe had always been able to get over a bust-up quickly. Her temper would flare and then drop, and life would go on. But Patrick had a moodier temperament and could stew in a black cloud for a whole evening. She was glad when he reminded her that he was going over to meet Dan and stay at his place that night, to help him cut down a dead tree the next morning. Glad that she could have the evening to herself, when she could try to claw back the good, happy feeling she'd had before. Of course, the memory of this crucified her now. The fact that she'd wanted an evening in alone, when she no longer had any choice in the matter. When pretty much every single sodding evening was spent alone on her sofa these days, with a yawning gap at the opposite end where Patrick should be sitting, feet companionably against hers, putting the day to bed between them. And then he hadn't come home the following day, and she'd assumed it must be because he was still angry with her, simmering away, unable to put the row behind him and move on. When she'd phoned Dan that morning, only to hear that Patrick hadn't even stayed over, she had taken it personally again, fretting that he must be feeling so cross with her that he hadn't wanted to come home. It was only hours later on, when there was still no word from him, that a creeping realization had started to dawn on her that perhaps something even worse might have happened. Her finger slid behind her right ear where there was a patch of dry, flaky skin that went up into her hairline. It had become a spot for Zoe to worry and pick at when she was feeling miserable, even though she knew she was probably making it worse. Almost home now, her cheeks flushed with the fresh air and exercise, she vowed to dig out some Vaseline or night cream to soothe the flare-up. Then she stopped dead on the pavement outside her house as she realised what was sitting on her doorstep. A large black cat she had never seen before, staring straight at her. The breath caught in her lungs. "Patrick?" she croaked, incredulous. At her approach, the cat's yellow eyes rounded with alarm, and it dropped into a crouch before streaking away, over the low wall into the next front garden, where it vanished amidst the shrubbery. She felt such an idiot as she searched for her keys and let herself in, leaning against the door once inside. Thank God none of her neighbours had just seen her addressing a random cat by her dead husband's name. They would think she'd utterly lost the plot. She put her head in her hands and stood there for a moment. Crying on a stranger in a shop the other day, talking to a cat. "Get a grip," she ordered herself through clenched teeth. Chapter 10. "Oh, hello," said Liz as she answered the door and saw Dan standing there. "Everything all right, love?" "Hi, Mum," said Dan. "Just thought I'd pop round." She raised her thinly plucked eyebrows, apparently startled, and peered at him. "Are you okay?" She wasn't quite stretching out a hand to check the temperature of his forehead, but Dan could tell that she was considering it. "Is something wrong?" "No," he felt slightly nettled that she had to ask. "I just thought I'd, drop in, say hello, see how you and Dad are." Clearly she did feel she had to ask, seeing as he hadn't actually done this for ages, he realised, stabbed by guilt as she finally allowed him in over the threshold. "Well, what a nice surprise. Lovely," she said, recovering herself. She patted her hair fretfully. It was straggly and out of shape, Dan noticed in dismay. Had she even brushed it that morning? "Derek!" she yelled up the stairs. "Our Daniel's here. Dropped in to say hello." "Is he all right?" came her husband's muffled response from somewhere above them, and Dan felt the smile on his face begin to stiffen like setting concrete. "Come and see for yourself," Liz ordered, ushering Dan through to the living room. Although, on retiring, Liz and Derek had moved out of the small Hammersmith house where Dan and his brother had grown up, the living room had been transplanted pretty much straight from there to here. The two sage-green sofas, one big, one small, formed an L shape around the television, flanked by the same nest of walnut tables that a young Dan had made dens with, and a bookcase where well-thumbed Wilbur Smiths cosied up alongside rank after rank of Danielle Steels. Even the fake coal gas fire was similar to the one that Dan had sat in front of after bath times, bundled up in his Star Wars dressing gown with a mug of bedtime cocoa. The same pictures were displayed along the mantelpiece and shelves, old-school photos of the boys with gappy teeth and bowl haircuts, Patrick and Zoe's wedding day, Dan's graduation, the grandchildren on Christmas Day, and a black-and-white picture of Liz and Derek's own wedding, a blizzard of confetti frozen in the air around them as they smiled shyly from the frame. Also, there was, Dan's least favourite photo, the one of Patrick getting him in a headlock on Brighton Beach when they were boys. The two of them had always got on pretty well as kids, but sometimes Patrick liked to remind Dan who was boss, by force if necessary. In the photo, both of them were grinning, although if you looked closely, as Dan had done, you could see the flash of humiliation on Dan's face, the grin actually fragile and fake. He could still hear even now his brother's mockery. "Baby, baby," when Dan had become tearful. Glancing behind him to find the room still empty, his mum was making drinks in the kitchen. He moved the picture out of view, behind a larger one of the family celebrating Liz and Derek's 40th wedding anniversary. That was better. "So," said his mum, walking in with a tray of tea things, "what brings you over here, then? Do sit down, Daniel. No need to stand on ceremony." He couldn't say again that he was just dropping in. He was starting to feel like his own echo chamber. He pulled out one of the tables from its nest and moved it near the sofa, so she had somewhere to put the tray. "It struck me on Mother's Day that I haven't seen you very much lately. Too busy with work stuff. So while I'm not in the office, I thought I could come over a bit more often, like Patrick used to." Liz's fingers trembled a little on the teacups. Her face was pale and makeup-free, and she looked small and shrunken in an oversized grey cardigan and navy trousers. "He was a good boy," she said automatically. It seemed to be her default response. "You mentioned Patrick's name. She told you how good he was." Perhaps Dan was feeling paranoid and defensive, because he found himself wondering if it might also be a slight dig at him in comparison. Was he a good boy too? "Yes," he agreed helplessly. "But now that he's not around, maybe I can stand in for him, if you like. Do the things Patrick used to do for you." "You don't have to stand in for him, love. You're your own person," she reminded him, pouring the tea. Her fingernails, usually glossily painted, were nude today and looked old and yellowy. When did her hands get so gnarled? Dan thought with a churn of sadness. "I know, but," he squirmed, "I just want to be helpful." "I see." She passed over a mug, then sipped from hers. "Derek," she called. "Tea?" Then she glanced towards the window. "Weather's on the turn," she commented. "Yes," he agreed. There was a small gap of silence, and then he asked, "So, is there anything, then, that I can do? I mean, to be helpful? Any little chores, or I could nip over to the shops for you, or fix anything that's broken?" His dad appeared in the doorway then, with his usual air of detached disinterest, and Dan found himself trailing off mid-sentence. "I love my kids so much," Patrick had once said down at the pub, staring into his pint glass. It must have been a few months after Bea was born, and he'd been jubilant all evening, if clearly exhausted, yet had suddenly become introspective, maudlin even. "I would do anything for them, But it makes me sad in a weird way, because I know our dad didn't feel the same way about us. Do you know what I mean?" Dan had felt startled at the time. Nobody wanted to be confronted with the idea that a parent hadn't loved them. But he had to admit that Derek Shepherd had never been a cuddly sort of a man. Had he ever even slung an arm around his boys? Kissed his wife in public? He had worked for years as an archivist in what had been Middlesex Poly, and always looked as if he'd rather be leafing through old papers than actually interacting with another human being. "Hello, son. Fancy seeing you here. To what do we owe this great honour, then?" Even a simple question had the ring of sarcasm when it came from his dad. Dan opened his mouth, but his mum beat him to it. "He's popped round to be helpful. To do our chores," she explained. "Has he?" His dad frowned, as if this was a bad thing, somehow impertinent, and Dan felt himself wanting to retreat, just as he had throughout various childhood battles. Then he looked out of the back window where, thank heavens, the lawn seemed kind of shaggy. Zoe might have rejected his mowing offer, but his dad had always grumbled about keeping the lawn in check. Surely this was his opportunity? "I could mow the lawn for you," he suggested. His parents looked at one another, unspoken questions flitting between them. Then his dad shrugged. "If you want to," he replied. "That would be very kind, Daniel," his mother said. Dan smiled at them both and drank his tea, but he couldn't shake off the feeling that they were, well, humouring him, not taking him very seriously. Had he got this wrong somehow? Heaving the mower out of the shed a short while later, he turned his head to see them both still in the living room, watching him. His mum put up a hand in a wave and he returned the gesture. This was a good, helpful thing to do, he reminded himself, as his dad opened the back door to show him the extension cable. Definitely worthy of an entry on his good deeds spreadsheet. For that alone, any awkwardness could be borne, he decided. Over in Chiswick, Lydia was struggling to concentrate. Just off the high street, the shop she worked in, Soft, sold a mixture of cushions and throws, as well as ceramics, wood block prints and jewellery by local artists, and she usually found it a soothing place to be. Encouraged by Jonathan, her boss, who was always telling her that her talents were wasted working for him, she made many of the cushion covers herself, from soft tweeds or muted Liberty prints, and there was always something to be done, even with a dearth of customers like today. But her thoughts were still whirling from the phone call last night, and now, as she looked around, she found despair leaking in. Would working here be enough to support them if Patrick decided to change the status quo? Was she about to receive a rude and scary financial wake-up call? Lydia had always loved making things, ever since she'd been a tiny girl. Back as a sixth former, she'd been offered a place to study costume design at university and had pored over details of the course's modules, corsetry, tailoring, millinery, and many other delights, so long and hard that even now she could picture the creased and grubby page in the prospectus. But when her mum, Eleanor, became ill that year, schoolwork no longer seemed a priority, and while her friends were revising, Lydia spent her days doggedly nursing her mother, willing her to get better. "Of course I'll get better," Eleanor had said, squeezing Lydia's hand. Her squeeze had been as faint as a fairy's, though, barely there. "Just as soon as I've beaten this, we'll go to Australia to celebrate. Do you hear? I've always wanted to show you my favourite beaches, take you around my city. What do you think?" It was the most precious offer of Lydia's life, but it had never come to fruition. Eleanor's condition worsened and she went into hospital, and then, only weeks later, she came home again because there was nothing more that could be done for her. She had lost her hair, and Lydia camped out by her side, cooling her hot bald head with a damp sponge and holding cups of water up to her cracked lips for her to sip. Studying didn't get much of a look in. Lydia didn't even wait for her exam results to know that she'd missed out on a place at university. But she was so numb with grief, she no longer cared all that much. Nothing seemed to matter compared to losing the person she loved most in the world. She'd done bits and bobs of work, and she'd always got by working in retail and as a PA for a while, before landing the arts centre job, which she'd loved. But of course, when Lydia became a mum herself, all that had ground to a halt, until Jemima started school and Jonathan had offered her some part-time work. She'd kidded herself at first. Hey, it was still a creative environment. She was working with artists, perhaps she could progress to helping select new pieces for the shelves. But the reality turned out to be far less scintillating. She spent most of the time on the till or directing out-of-towners towards the tube. Jonathan had been her mum's best friend when Eleanor first came over from Sydney and did his best to be the supportive godfather, encouraging Lydia to take evening classes and get back into education. But at the end of the day, she had to be pragmatic. Yes, but how would she afford it? And who was going to look after Jemima? It wasn't as easy as he seemed to think. Crossing the room to add new stock to the shelves, Lydia caught sight of her reflection in the mirror and did a double take, before sheepishly recognising herself. Usually she wore colourful vintage-style outfits that she had made herself, but today she had deliberately chosen more sober clothing for the occasion. Her one and only black knee-length skirt, with a smart blouse in olive green, prim gold studs at her ears, black court shoes. She wanted to look like the sort of person who'd say, "I will have to consult my lawyer about this," who would be taken seriously should any disagreements arise. A woman in a stylish grey trouser suit with clicking high heels came into the shop just then and went on to make several purchases. One of Martha Mackey's gorgeous fox-shaped copper brooches, a framed print by Ivo Cook of swallows in flight, and a 1950s-style lampshade that Lydia herself had rather coveted, made from sailcloth with a repeating boat design. "Lovely choices," Lydia said, wrapping everything up carefully and ringing them into the till. Most people paid by card these days, especially when the total amount due was well over £200, like now. But this customer pulled out a burgundy mock croc purse and began counting out a fat stack of notes in payment. 10, 20, she said, pushing them over to Lydia. Once the shop was empty again, Lydia's thoughts kept turning to all the cash that was now sitting there in the till. All the things you could buy with it. If she ended up hitting rock bottom financially, would she be tempted to start pocketing money from future cash sales like this, and not running the payments through the system? Would Jonathan even notice if she helped herself? His 60th birthday was coming up and he was distracted, planning an elaborate party and obsessing about cocktails and outfits. It wouldn't be hard to sneak the odd 100 here or there, if need be. The doorbell jangled again as a new customer came in, and Lydia snapped to attention, horrified that her thoughts had taken such a deceitful turn. She had always prided herself on her honesty. She had never stolen anything in her life. What the hell was wrong with her? Was it the prospect of meeting Patrick's brother later on that was prompting such weird behaviour? If so, the sooner it was over with, the better. Back home after visiting his parents, Dan found himself staring out at his own garden, most notably at the dead sycamore that still loomed there. Whenever he walked into the kitchen like now, his gaze was drawn to it through the window, the diseased branches rattling like bones in the wind, lifeless and leafless. A taunt. It should have been cut down and removed back in February with Patrick as planned, but, well, events and all that. Events. He had been standing pretty much right here when Zoe had rung the morning after his and Patrick's last night at the pub. He almost hadn't answered when he saw her name flash up on the phone, rolling his eyes at the thought of his brother wimpishly getting his wife to ring up and apologise. Patrick feels really bad for what happened. Yeah, well, that wasn't going to cut it. This time Patrick had gone too far. But she turned out to be calling about something else altogether. "Sorry to bother you, Dan, but could you get my husband to give me a ring, please?" she asked. "Not now, if he's wielding a power tool or up the tree, obviously, but just when there's a good moment. He's not answering his phone." Dan had snorted, guessing that Patrick must be on his way round after all then, probably stuck in traffic. Huh. He'd get short shrift if he tried knocking on the door like nothing had happened. In fact, he'd be lucky to escape without any chainsaw wounds, the mood Dan was still in. "He's not here," he replied curtly. "Oh," said Zoe. What time did he leave then? I thought it would take you too longer, I have to say. Right. Maybe that's why he's not answering. Is your garden looking better for the surgery? They were talking at cross purposes, Dan realised, frowning. No, I mean, he's not been here at all. He didn't stay last night. There was a moment of baffled silence, and they both spoke at once. So he didn't... Dan began. He's not been here either, Zoe said at the same time. There was a small hesitation before she gave a nervous sort of laugh and asked, So, where did he spend the night? Or shouldn't I be asking that? I assumed he was going back to yours, Dan said. This admittedly put a new spin on things. Where had Patrick gone? He didn't come back. I'm not at work today. I was hoping to... Zoe broke off. So what happened then? Why was there a change of plan? Dan gritted his teeth. If this was Patrick disappearing in a massive huff in an attempt to manipulate Dan into guilt, then he simply wasn't going to rise to it. He refused to feel guilty about anything when Patrick was the one squarely to blame. We had a bit of an argument, he said. He was walking back along the Thames last I saw, so I assumed he was heading home. From Hammersmith? Why didn't he get a cab? She had a point. But Patrick probably just wanted to skulk off alone, Dan figured, rather than accompany his brother back to the main road. He might even have slunk into the Dove nearby for a consoling whiskey before going any further. I don't know, it all got kind of heated, he admitted. He was not going to feel bad about this, he reminded himself. He was not. Well, what about? What was so terrible that he didn't go back to yours? Dan hesitated for a moment, his eye caught by the starling that was back in the garden, hopping about thuggishly, head cocked. Dan? Zoe prompted, and he had to think quickly. No way could he tell her the truth. Absolutely no way. It was nothing, he said eventually. Too much to drink. Have you tried his business phone? Maybe the battery's flat on his other one. Yeah, it's in the house somewhere. I can hear it ringing. Bloody hell, where is he then? Let me know if he turns up, won't you? And I'll do the same. Dan hadn't been too worried at first, assuming his brother must have spent the night at a mate's house, where he was now sleeping off the booze. No doubt he'd appear at Zoe shortly with a bunch of daffs and a series of excuses and charm a smile out of her. He was good at that. Dan said you'd had a bit of a row, Zoe would venture after a while. But he would brush it off. Not important, he'd reply. But it was important to Dan, all right. The day lengthened and turned into evening, and still no word came from Patrick. Liz rang, having been contacted by Zoe, wanting to know what the argument had been about. I hope you haven't gone and upset him, she chided. You know how sensitive he can be. This was Patrick all over, Dan thought, rolling his eyes. The only person who could wallow about in shit and come up smelling sweet. Sensitive indeed. Last night Patrick had been about as sensitive as a brick through a window in terms of how he'd spoken to Dan. All the same, Dan was beginning to feel a creeping dread that something was badly wrong. Because Patrick wasn't one to flake out and vanish for hours on end like this. Yeah, he might be unreliable at times, but he was wedded to that phone of his for starters. It was completely out of character for him to ignore calls and messages, to stay away. By the time Dan spoke to Zoe again and outlined his worries, she was already one step ahead, having contacted local hospitals, friends, family, and minutes earlier, the police. I don't understand what was so bad that he didn't stay at yours, she fretted. Are you keeping something from me? Or covering for him? Because I need to know now, all right? Forget brotherly loyalty or whatever code you've got going on. I need to know he's okay, Dan. The questions had left him squirming. He'd cobbled together some lines in response, so flimsy you could have blown them over with a single puff. But even as he said them, he could tell Zoe didn't quite believe him. They had more important things to dwell on, though, namely that the hours were passing and there was still no word from Patrick. Looking back, Dan could hardly remember how they dragged themselves through that time, how they filled the strange expectant days that followed, as the dread ratcheted up with every tick of the clock. It had felt as if they were collectively going out of their minds. People didn't simply disappear like that, he kept thinking. Not grown men, with a family and a business, and all the trappings of a great life. 4 days later, the police were in touch again. A man's body had been found washed up in Vauxhall, and when Zoe was asked to go and identify it, she was able to confirm that yes, it was her husband, her late husband, Patrick Christopher Shepherd, who was dead and not coming back. The police wanted to speak to Dan as the last person known to have seen him alive that night. Was Dan to blame? It felt that way. Guilt assaulted him like a knee in the balls, closely followed by the twin blows of shock and grief. Patrick had gone from their lives just like that, and they would never be able to see one another again, let alone make up and put things right. He still dreamed about that final glimpse of his brother, dreamed that they were on the river path together, and that he, Dan, had had a change of heart, calling Patrick back. "Don't be daft, you can stay," he said in these dreams, gruff with reluctance. "Not that this means I forgive you, because I don't, you piece of shit. But you can stay, all right?" That was what brothers did, wasn't it? They stuck together through good and bad, thick as thieves. But it hadn't happened that way. In real life, Patrick had kept on walking, while Dan had been unable to find the words or grace to stop him. It was a living nightmare. None of them could take the news in at first. Dan found himself obsessively wondering how his brother had ended up in the river. What awful chain of events had led to this terrible, horrible outcome? Patrick had always been a strong swimmer, confident in the pool or sea. He was fit and healthy. His death a mystery. Not knowing how he had died, what had happened in those last moments of his life, was torturous. Had he been frightened when the end came? Had he even been conscious? Dan kept picturing his brother's face sinking below the surface, the river swallowing him up. He had once seen a dead dog wash up by the side of the Thames over in Greenwich, and he'd never been able to forget its bloated, distorted corpse, its misshapen head with empty sockets where the fish had eaten its eyeballs. He kept imagining Patrick's lifeless body, dirty and sodden, dumped on the muddy riverbank by the tide, and it was the worst image in the world. The post-mortem revealed a head injury, but it was explained to them that this could have been from Patrick falling and hitting his head before entering the river, or, equally, an attack, a mugging that had left him reeling and unbalanced. And where exactly had he gone into the river anyway? Dan walked and cycled the Thames path fairly regularly, and found himself retracing his brother's likely steps there over and over again. Large stretches of the path had railings or shrubbery that separated pedestrians from the water, but there were other areas with nothing to prevent a man from falling and drowning, or for that matter, throwing himself in deliberately. But he wouldn't have done that, would he? Not Patrick. He loved life, or so Dan had always thought. He certainly had plenty to live for. The usual weary sadness had descended, and Dan dragged his eyes away from the garden now. Really, he knew he should hire a tree surgeon to deal with the sycamore for him. Just get rid of the thing once and for all. One of the neighbours had asked the other day, rather pointedly, when it would be removed. But the dead tree had become so tied up with Patrick's last night and Dan's guilt that he felt a mental block there, paralysing him from taking action. He went to find his car keys, trying to shake off his unhappiness. In half an hour, he was due to meet Lydia Fox, and he'd have to explain a potted version of his brother's death to her, as well as finding out what had been happening with her and Patrick all these years. He felt on his guard, deeply suspicious. Deeply loyal to Zoe, too. But when he'd spoken to this Lydia the day before, the conversation had been very odd. Patrick must have given her a false name. Armstrong indeed, he scoffed to himself. Typical. He was surprised Patrick hadn't told her his surname was Testosterone, frankly. And she sounded wary about their prospective meeting, as if she didn't trust Dan's motives. To be fair, she should be wary, though, because he fully intended to warn her well away from Zoe and the children. Seeing that business card with her name on it on Zoe's fridge had nearly given Dan a coronary, and he'd immediately leapt to worst-case conclusions. That Lydia planned to blackmail Zoe or con her somehow. That she was up to no good and needed to be stopped. He had been cursing himself for having blurted out his shock like that, in Zoe's kitchen. Wait, so you know her? This Lydia Fox? Because after that he hadn't been able to pocket the business card and take it away for fear of drawing attention to it even more. He'd had to sneakily photograph the details when Zoe went to answer the front door, his mind racing. But clearly Zoe didn't know Lydia was anything other than a woman she'd met in a shop, and Dan wanted it to stay that way. Today he would make it very clear to Lydia, do not speak to Zoe. Keep your distance. Oh, and that money Patrick's been paying you? It has to come to an end now, because I can't let Zoe find out that you exist. Got it? By the way, if you were wondering why he hadn't been in touch with you, it's because he died. God, he wasn't looking forward to any of this. Dan wasn't the sort of unreconstructed bloke who flinched and vanished to the bar when anyone started talking about their feelings. But all the same, such talk made him feel uncomfortable, itchy around the collar. This was going to be one of the most excruciating conversations of his life. He could already tell. He hoped this Lydia person wouldn't start crying and freaking out. Why don't you ask him that? She'd said, when he'd mentioned her relationship with Patrick. Present tense, as if it was possible to ask Patrick anything now. It sounded as if she still thought he was alive, unless she'd spent last night frantically Googling him, now that she knew his real name, of course. They had arranged to meet at the cafe in Gunnersbury Park, a modern low-built space all chunky wood and glass amidst the trees. And as Dan loped across the grass towards it, he could feel his blood pressure rising, shots of stress percolating through his veins. What was he walking into here? Who was Lydia, and what kind of hold had she wielded over Patrick? He kept picturing a hard-faced woman with a cold glare, while labels like homewrecker and bunny boiler looped in his head. Maybe she had been blackmailing Patrick. Maybe she'd pinned something dastardly on him and had him pay for it ever since. He sighed, unable to fully believe any of these ideas. There had to be a rational explanation to all this, surely. Something he hadn't thought of. Who knew? In 10 minutes, the two of them might be laughing at his stupidity and misunderstanding. Anyway, enough second-guessing. Right now, he needed to focus on the matter in hand, how he was going to make all of this go away, for Zoe's sake. Whoever this Lydia was, and whatever her game, he would waste no time in clearing everything up, once and for all. Chapter 11. The path was wet following a heavy shower earlier, and the trees still dripped percussively as Dan approached the cafe entrance, the air fresh with the scent of pine. The sodden picnic tables outside were deserted, but the lights were bright inside the building, drawing him on. "I've got a red Mac," Lydia had said, as if they were meeting on a blind date, and Dan, getting out of his car 10 minutes ago, imagined how boring his own description would have been in comparison. Jeans and a navy hoodie. That really marked him out from every other middle-aged bloke. Not. As soon as he walked in, he saw her. Long chestnut hair falling about a heart-shaped face. Small, neat features, both hands cradling a steaming mug. The red Mac was drying on the back of the chair next to hers, with a cycle helmet dangling from one side. She looked up, her gaze meeting his, and something quickened inside his body, an unexpected chemical reaction. Because she was pretty, he guessed, rather than the mean, unpleasant version that his imagination had conjured up. He hadn't anticipated her looking quite so sweet. "Lydia?" he asked, walking over with trepidation. It must be her. The only other people in the place were an elderly couple sharing a huge slab of Victoria sponge, plus a young man with damp, dark hair who was hunched over a sketchbook, pencil in hand. She offered a small, polite smile in response, although he could see how apprehensive she was. "Hi," she said. "You look like him," she blurted out. Then her cheeks turned pink, as if she'd gone in too personal too soon. He ignored the remark, unsure how to answer it. Until he knew more about Lydia Fox, he didn't want to get too cozy. Coolly detached, that was his game today. "Can I get you anything? Another drink?" he asked. "Because it's the only thing I'll be offering you today," he thought. "Other than a one-way ticket out of my family's life, that is." She shook her head, so he went to the counter and ordered a latte. "With an extra shot, please," he asked, feeling in urgent need of caffeine. Anything that might help him get through this. He sat down opposite her and opened his mouth to begin, but she beat him to it. "I don't know your name," she said. "Oh, it's Daniel," he replied. "Dan." "Dan," she repeated. "Hi, Dan. Actually, I think I remember him talking about you now." She offered him a wary smile, but Dan's face didn't know what to do in response. A grimace was about the best he could manage. Don't start trying to make friends with me, he thought, remembering Zoe's drooping shoulders in the supermarket, remembering how much he owed her. "Hi," he said. So what's all this about?" she said over him. His mouth was dry and he gulped some too hot coffee, with a tiny prickle of irritation that she kept taking the reins of the conversation when he was the one who should rightfully have been steering. Now he felt wrong-footed before he'd even begun. "It's about Patrick," he replied stiffly. "Yes," she said. "I gathered that much." Her eyes were dark brown and anxious. She was gripping her mug. This would all have been far easier if she looked less like a worried fawn, Dan thought, bracing himself for what was to come. "I don't think you know what's happened. I'm pretty sure you don't. So I'm just going to tell you," he began. The coffee and adrenaline were both doing a good job of making his pulse accelerate. "And I'm really sorry because this is horrible news, but, well, the thing is, he's died. Patrick's died." There. He risked a direct look at Lydia and she stared back, her face sagging in shock. What? He's died? Shit. So clearly this was the first she'd heard about it. Where did she think Patrick had been all this time, then? Yes, 6 weeks on from the event, it still wasn't any easier to say the words aloud. He drowned. He drowned? She clapped a hand to her mouth and blinked several times. When he looked at her again, he could see that her eyes were glistening with tears. Oh my God. I'm so sorry. I can't believe it. That was the last thing I expected you to say. A tear broke free from her lashes and rolled down her face, dragging a streak of sooty mascara with it. I know. He stared at the table. He was walking home one night. He'd had a few drinks. We think he just got unlucky and fell in the river, but... He shrugged unhappily, forcing himself to say the next words. We don't know what happened. He was on his own, see, so... Emotion caught up with him. He was on his own. Patrick had died on his own, water pouring into his lungs, his body sinking below the black surface of the river, when he should have been in Dan's spare room snoring and muttering in his sleep. It was a terrible, terrible way to go. That's awful. That's so tragic. I'm so sorry, Lydia said again, anguished. Her face had already been pale, but it was chalk white suddenly. Dan hoped she wasn't going to faint or throw up or have some other extreme physical reaction. Oh God, and now Jemima will never get to know... She added, but bit back the rest of the sentence before she could finish it. Jemima. He felt sick. So much for he and Lydia laughing about his misunderstanding as he'd hoped. It seemed as if his first guess had been right all along. That's your kid? He asked, feeling something crumbling inside him. Oh, Patrick. He couldn't quite believe it. Yeah, and Patrick's. Your niece, I guess. Dan blinked. His niece. Christ. He supposed she was. He hadn't thought of it like that. He had been so caught up in his need to protect Zoe that he hadn't considered much else. Yeah, he said, taken aback. Now Lydia was rummaging in her bag, for a tissue he assumed, until he realised she was looking for her phone to show him a photo. No, he wanted to say, one hand up like a police officer stopping traffic. Don't show me. He needed this woman and her kid to be forgettable, anonymous. A part of Patrick's life that he could effectively close down and sever. But it was too late. Here, she said, holding up the phone. A girl with brown hair in bunches smiled out at him, a gap between her two front teeth. Freckles sprayed across her nose. This is her. She's 7. The girl's face was animated and expressive. It looked as if she was in the middle of laughing or sharing a joke. And again Dan felt a zap of connection because she looked remarkably like Bea. They could practically be sisters, he thought, before remembering that, in a half sense, they were. Her hair was a different colour, more like Lydia's chestnut than Bea's sandy blonde. But the nose was the same and her smile was just like Patrick's. He found that he had a lump in his throat. Before now, this girl, Jemima, had been nothing more than a shadowy possibility that Dan had struggled to believe in. But now she was real. A human being. Patrick's other daughter. Dan was unnerved by how much this had thrown him off course. She's lovely, he said brokenly. She actually really looks... He was about to blurt out, like my other niece, but he couldn't. He couldn't link them aloud like that, for Zoe's sake. Did Lydia even know that Patrick had other children? He had to tread carefully here, not let his mouth run away with him. Time to change the subject. So, you and Patrick, when did you... how long were you... He couldn't even finish his own questions. Part of him didn't want to know any details, because on some level he still kept expecting it to be a trick, not true. At the same time, another part of him needed to establish the basics, to peg this story into some kind of frame. He needed also to understand why it had happened, how Patrick could have done this to Zoe and the kids. How long were we together? 5 months or so, she replied. He dumped me when I found out I was pregnant. It wasn't planned, admittedly, but Patrick really didn't want to know. Washed his hands of me the same day and said never to contact him again, which was nice. Her expression hardened. He had hurt her, Dan could see. But when she caught him looking at her, she dropped her gaze. Sorry, it feels wrong now to say anything bad. Dan was unable to keep up. Wait, how old did you say Jemima was? She's 7. And amazing. Her face was a mixture of pride and defiance, as if daring him to dispute this. I had no idea Patrick was married. That's how naive I was. But all the same, when I got pregnant... She flushed. It was an accident, like I said, but I didn't want to just get rid of her. He told me to. He said he'd pay for, an abortion. She stumbled over the word. But I decided to keep her. This was all happening too quickly for Dan to stay on top of. You didn't know Patrick was married, he repeated, trying to piece the story together in a way that he could comprehend, find a narrative where his brother didn't appear like such a bad guy. No, because he didn't mention it. And I assumed, well, you do assume, don't you? If someone's flirting and flattering you, that they're not already hooked up. It didn't cross my mind that he was married. Not for a second. Her voice rose. What? Do you think I'd have gone out with him if I knew he had a wife? She gave a mocking laugh, her eyes so stony, Dan was starting to feel unnerved. I'm not like that, she said, jabbing the air. Then her lips trembled and she put a hand to her face. I can't believe he's dead. Sorry, it keeps hitting me. I know it was a long time ago. I haven't even seen him since then. But I always kind of hoped that Jemima would meet him one day, all the same. That he'd love her as much as I do. Dan still felt miles behind, bogged down by his earlier assumptions. Lydia wasn't, in fact, a homewrecker. Probably not an evil blackmailer either. So you weren't together anymore after she was born, he said. Surely he had got this wrong somewhere. He and Jemima... She shook her head. Never met. He wasn't interested. You could see how much this had wounded her, but she was proud too, because as soon as she'd made herself vulnerable by saying the words, she shot him a look that said, clear as anything, don't you dare pity me for this. But it was too late, because he did. He felt terrible for her, really hurt on her behalf. Sorry, he mumbled, appalled by his brother's atrocious behaviour. That's pretty crap. Not seeing your own child, ever. Not even once. It was more than crap. It was abhorrent. What had Patrick been thinking? His loss, Lydia said, and her face was so tight, so fierce, that it looked as if she might punch your head in, if you dared suggest she might have lost out on anything. Yes, Dan agreed. He couldn't help thinking of how much Patrick had loved his 3 children, how enormously proud he had been of each of them, and how secure and happy they had been with him as their father. Yes, it was Patrick's loss not to know this fourth secret child of his. But Christ, it was the little girl's loss too, that she'd never been part of her dad's life. Not that Dan would dare to venture anything so tactless, mind, while Lydia still looked so combative. God, I'm really sorry, he said again. I had no idea. She shrugged, clearly not wanting his sympathy. We manage. There was a momentary silence, and then he remembered how he'd got her number in the first place. The final mystery to clear up. One other thing, he said. The card you gave Zoe, that was how I got your phone number. It was up on her fridge. This is your sister-in-law, she said tartly. The one I'm supposedly harassing. He lowered his eyes. Ah, yes, he'd forgotten he'd bandied that particular accusation around. Sorry, he said again. I was confused. How do you two know each other, though? I wasn't sure what to say. Zoe mentioned that she'd met you in a shop or something. Lydia shook her head blankly. I don't think I know anyone called Zoe, she replied, adding with a sarcastic side-eye. I'm pretty sure I'd have remembered meeting Patrick's wife. The business card was from a shop in Chiswick. Dan got out his phone and showed her the photo he'd taken of it, with Lydia's name and phone number handwritten there. Unless Zoe has somehow tracked you down herself and... But Lydia's face had cleared. Oh, God, she said. That was Zoe. She put a hand to her mouth, eyes wide as the pieces fitted together. Okay, it makes sense. She was crying in the street. I had no idea who she was, and I looked after her, basically, until she felt better. She did say that she'd lost her husband recently. She blinked aghast. Then, a few days later, she came back. She'd brought me some flowers. Unless she's an amazing actor, I think it must have been a total coincidence. They stared at one another. How did that even happen in a city like London? She seemed so upset I gave her my number in case she wanted someone to talk to, Lydia went on. Honestly, that's all it was. I felt sorry for her. She bit her lip, gazing down at the table. She's very pretty, she said, almost to herself. Then she frowned. So what do I do if she rings me up for a chat? I can't pretend this hasn't happened, can I? Can't you? Dan replied weakly. The situation was getting more complicated by the minute. So much for cutting Lydia neatly out of the picture before Zoe got a sniff of her. Too late for that. Lydia seemed shocked. No, she told him. What, lie to a grieving widow when our kids are half-sisters and brothers? Wait, what are they, by the way? Boys or girls? These are Jemima's half-siblings and I don't even know their names. Dan hesitated. It was as if Pandora's box had cracked open and he was powerless to close it again. Would it be disloyal of him to tell Lydia their names? But how could he refuse when, as she said herself, they were the half-brothers and sister of her own daughter? Ethan, Gabe, and Bea, he mumbled. She nodded, digesting the information. Nice, she said after a moment. Wow, Jemima did always want to have brothers and sisters. So how old are they? This was all going too fast, becoming too messy. He owed it to them and to Zoe not to say any more. Right? Well, the thing is, he began helplessly, floundering for how to dig his way out. Her eyes narrowed as she scrutinized him for a long, uncomfortable moment. Then she leaned back in her chair. Oh, I get it. Silly me. Let me guess. You didn't come here today wanting to play happy families. You actually came to tell me there'll be no more money. Hard shit, the wife wants me to fuck off back under my rock. There was an awkward beat of silence. Then she barked a mirthless laugh when he didn't correct her. Right. As I thought. Dan swallowed because all of that was exactly why he had come here, of course. But meeting Lydia had made him feel differently. She was no longer merely a name on a bank statement. She was a person with feelings. Someone he'd witnessed go through suspicion, disbelief, sadness, anger, and pride, all in a matter of minutes. What was more, she was the mother of Patrick's other daughter. No, it's not that, he heard himself say. Like it or not, this child, Jemima, was family. If he dismissed her and Lydia now, he would be acting in the same callous way as his brother. It turned out he couldn't do that. But what would this mean in practical terms, he wondered in the next breath. How could he possibly square the situation with Zoe? Oh, by the way, your kids have got a half-sister. Surprise! Patrick's been paying her off for years, and I know he's dead now, but she should still get something, right? Maybe from the life insurance? Lydia's face looked pinched and defiant. I don't want his money anyway, she said, chin up, before he could speak. I did tell him not to bother in the first place, that we were fine without him, but... I'll find a way, Dan blurted out, a hot wave of shame washing over him in the next second as he imagined Zoe's face if she ever got to hear of this conversation. You told her what? I mean, I could ignore the direct debit that's already set up, pretend I hadn't seen it, so that the monthly payment keeps on going out to you. No thanks. Or look, I'll give you money for your daughter myself. I'm her uncle, like you said. Surely I... No, we don't need anyone's charity. She was pretty magnificent in her anger, it had to be said. She stood up, snatching her damp mac and cycle helmet from the chair, no longer looking him in the eye. Forget it. Thanks for letting me know and everything. You've done your bit. We'll be fine. Sorry to hear about your brother, she added, as an afterthought. And then, before he could react, she was walking stiffly away, without a single glance back. Dan found himself marvelling at how angry a person could look, just from the rigidity of their shoulders, while simultaneously shrivelling inside at how badly the encounter had ended. Cut them loose, get rid, he had told himself half an hour ago. Yet it wasn't quite as simple as that. In fact, he was pretty sure this wasn't going to be simple at all.
This is the end of CD4. The book continues on CD5. CD5.
Chapter 12. Ah, you made it! Not chopped up in a bin bag or held hostage in some perv's flat. Relief! Cried Bridget, as Lydia arrived at the school gate later on. Lydia's smile felt kind of wobbly in reply. Relief wasn't exactly the word she would use about how she felt right now. But yes, at least she wasn't dead or kidnapped, she supposed. A fairly low bar for a silver lining, but she needed to take the positives where she could find them today. Her emotions were still in turmoil. Patrick is dead. Patrick is dead, she kept repeating numbly to herself. When she wasn't agonizing over her stupid, blurted-out refusal of his money, that was. What had she been thinking? I made it, was all she said. And? Bridget prompted. She was a big woman, and loud with it. the sort of person who naturally attracted attention. Even now there were people looking over at them. Lydia put a finger to her lips and edged away from the crowd. "I've just met Patrick's brother," she said in a low voice. "Patrick," Bridget repeated, frowning. Then her eyes bulged as the penny dropped. Whoa, what? The Patrick? You're seeing his brother now? No, not like that. Really not like that. Lydia glanced round to make sure nobody could hear them. He asked to meet me because, well, to tell me that... The school caretaker had come to unlock the gates and the waiting parents began streaming through them towards the various classrooms. Lydia and Bridget hung back. He died, she finished bluntly. Patrick. He drowned. Foolishly, tears had come to her eyes because it was so strange to say these words, and for them to be true. He had always been so rudely alive. That was the thing. Full of vitality, so quick and strong and sexy. He lit up a room merely by walking into it. She couldn't take her eyes off him. For a long time after their breakup, she kept expecting to bump into him, would scan groups of people, wondering if Patrick's face would be among theirs. But she hadn't seen him again, and now she never would. He had gone. Oh my God! Babe, I'm so sorry. How are you feeling? Bridget gathered her up in an embrace, and for a few brief moments Lydia allowed her emotions to assail her, the memories sweeping in through her mind, all those shared moments of happiness. The first time he'd come over to her place, for instance, a Tuesday afternoon when they'd both bunked off work. "I've got a migraine coming," she had told her boss, heavy-lidded before practically skipping down the road to catch the tube. She and Patrick had fallen into bed together an hour later, with the sun streaming through the window onto their bodies. How glorious it had felt, how perfect. Afterwards, lying there in each other's arms, the sultry sound of someone practicing a clarinet had wafted in on the breeze. "This is our theme tune," he'd said, moments before the musician had played a wrong note, at which they both burst out laughing. The evening he had surprised her by waiting outside her office one sunny day, with a picnic and cold bottle of Cava. They sat in Richmond Park and fed each other fat scarlet strawberries, and she thought she might very well die from sheer contentment. She still found herself thinking about him whenever she ate strawberries. The weekend they spent in the South Downs together, staying in a 900-year-old castle with mullioned windows and a view of the moat. They had imagined themselves king and queen, and she had told Patrick she loved him for the first time. "Oh God, me too. You have no idea how much," he replied with such earnest sincerity she almost couldn't bear the intensity. This is it, she had told herself, heart melting as she woke before him on the Sunday morning and drank in the gorgeous sight of her sleeping man. This is the one. Always and forever. I love him. It had killed her once she knew the truth about him, to wonder what he told his wife on all these occasions. Working late? Stag do? Poker night with the lads? She would probably never know now. But how could anyone live with themselves, lying so blatantly to the person they supposedly loved? On it had gone anyway, happy time after happy time, until her pill let her down. In hindsight, it must have been a bout of food poisoning that was to blame. And then came the positive pregnancy test. Shortly after which, of course, he had done his vanishing trick, neatly removing himself from her life as if snipping himself out of a picture. "I feel a bit strange," Lydia confessed now, disentangling herself from Bridget and delving into her pocket for a tissue. "Like It wasn't as if he was ever going to leave his wife for me or anything, and I knew it was over. He didn't make any bones about that. All the same, though, I feel for Jemima, because now she'll never meet him. She blew her nose. Speaking of which, we should go and get the kids. If they talked any longer, she'd end up admitting that she had told Patrick's brother to stick his maintenance payments, and Bridget would give her 7 shades of hell for it. Plus, there was the whole business about accidentally having met Patrick's wife that she needed to digest in private too. "I suppose so," said Bridget. She gave Lydia's hand a squeeze. "You know where I am, though, if you need me, yeah? Or if you and Jem want to come back with us now for a cup of tea?" "Thanks," said Lydia. "But we'll be okay. I just need to get my head around it, I think." "Sure thing," said Bridget, as they joined the steady procession of parents through the gate. "What was he like then, the brother?" she asked, elbowing Lydia. "Another good-looking sod like Patrick." Lydia smiled faintly. "He was..." She had to stop and consider the question for a moment. She had been so taken up by what Dan was saying that she hadn't really formed much of an opinion on those terms. What was it Patrick had said about him all those years ago? "He got the brains, I got the looks," or something along those lines. "They do look alike," she said. "You can tell they're brothers. Same eyebrows." She pulled a face at how irrelevant this was, under the circumstances. "He was all right, I suppose. We got off on the wrong foot at first, but then he was okay. Mind you, I stormed off at the end because..." She clammed up, cursing her own runaway mouth. Hadn't she just vowed not to get into this particular part of the conversation? "Because..." prompted her friend. Lydia shot her a rueful look. They were almost outside the classroom now, and there were too many other parents around for her to take the story any further. "I'll have to tell you later," she said. "If you promise you won't be cross with me." Bridget groaned, giving her a stern look. "Lydia Fox, what have you gone and done now?" Chapter 13. "Mummy," said Bea through a mouthful of sandwich. "Yes, darling." It was Wednesday afternoon and they had retreated to the car for the last 20 minutes of Gabe's football practice. The temperature had dropped outside and Zoe was worried about Bea's cough getting worse if they stood around for much longer in the slicing wind. Now, sitting in the passenger seat as a treat, still wearing her pink fleecy hat, Bea had remembered she had some of her packed lunch left over from earlier and was tucking in. "I was just wondering, do you think there are any sandwiches in heaven?" she asked, as strands of grated cheese fell onto her school skirt. "Try not to drop bits, love. Look, it's going everywhere," Zoe said, suppressing her irritation as Bea promptly brushed them all off her knee and into the footwell. "Do you, though?" "Do I think they have sandwiches in heaven? This had been happening a lot recently. Bea asking very specific questions about heaven, as if she was trying to pin down the precise details in her head. "I guess so." Zoe studied her daughter's expression. "Are you thinking about Daddy?" "Yes, because he does like bacon sandwiches so much. I hope he has lots of them. And ketchup. Is there ketchup in heaven?" She licked some butter off her finger, her face turned expectantly to Zoe. There was a small frown between her eyebrows, as if the ketchup issue was worrying her. "Oh, I should think there'll be plenty," Zoe replied, in as hearty a voice as she could manage. She was always left feeling uneasy about these conversations. Having set out to be vague and reassuring in her talk of heaven, being pinned down on the specifics, like the ketchup stock issues, felt a lot like lying. But what was the alternative? "If it's comforting to be, then I think that's okay," her mum had reassured her on the phone, and Zoe was inclined to agree. What if there's just brown sauce, though? He doesn't even like that. Or if they say, sorry, no bacon, it's only tuna today. He hates tuna. Bea had always been the most tender-hearted of her children, and her blue eyes were filling at the thought of her dad being deprived so cruelly. He'll be sad, won't he? And hungry. Zoe put her hand on Bea's. I'm pretty sure that heaven is a really nice place where nothing bad happens, she said firmly. So it's always sunny, with plenty of bacon sandwiches, and Daddy will feel very well looked after and not sad or hungry at all. She was making the afterlife sound like a great holiday, with an endless breakfast buffet and fantastic room service, she realised. Still, there were worse analogies. But he'll miss us, though, won't he? Because we miss him? Yes, but some people think that when you're in heaven, you can look down at the world and see everyone you loved there and still be a part of their lives. Sort of. Okay, so now she was getting into murkier waters. Having read up on what to say to bereaved children, she knew that this notion could be soothing, but also potentially alarming to the more literal-minded. So he can see me on the toilet, or getting told off at school? Well, trust Bea to go for the most prosaic examples. Maybe the idea wasn't as soothing as Zoe had hoped. I don't think so, she hedged. But I like to believe that if I'm talking to him, he can hear me, which makes me feel a bit better. Bea considered this for a moment. What sort of things do you say to him? This definitely wasn't the time to confess to all the angry remarks Zoe had made to Patrick during her darkest hours. Well, I tell him that I miss him, and I wish he was here. Sometimes when I go to the cemetery, I tell him things that have happened at home. What you and the boys have been up to. Bea chewed the last corner of her sandwich, pondering this. Can we talk to him now? Yes, absolutely. Zoe squeezed her hand. What would you like to say? Bea rubbed a wet circle in the condensation on the window so that she could see out, and peered up towards the sky. Daddy, she said in her bossiest voice, can you hear me? There was a pause while they both listened. Stupidly, Zoe found herself waiting for a sign once more. A patter of raindrops on the car roof, a feather dropping from the sky onto the windscreen. Nothing, of course. I'm sure he can, darling. Carry on, she said. Daddy, it's me, Bea. I've got something very important to say to you. She continued, still gazing through her peephole. This is it. Don't look at me when I'm on the toilet, okay? Don't, because that would be rude. Okay, Daddy? Despite the situation, Zoe found herself wanting to giggle all of a sudden. Bea looked so severe and disapproving. She was even wagging a finger. Anything else? She managed to say in a strangled voice. I miss you, Daddy. Really, a lot. L-O-T. She spelled out for good measure. I did well on my spellings this week, by the way, and... She paused, frowning as she searched for inspiration. And Gabe got in trouble with the head teacher for... Okay, let's not tell tales to Daddy, Zoe interrupted. They could be here all day if this turned into a supergrass session. Let's just say nice things, all right? Bea cupped her hands to her mouth. I love you, Daddy. You're the best. But remember what I said about the toilet, okay? She cocked her head as if listening, then nodded in satisfaction. He said okay. Good. And that he loves me better than the boys. He did. He said that to me. Well, maybe keep that bit as a secret, okay? Look, here comes Gabe now. Hop into the back again and put your seatbelt on, darling, that's it. She smiled at Bea. Well done. Let's do that another time. I bet Daddy really loved hearing your message. Hi, Gabe, in you get. Let's go home. That evening, Dan sat in front of his laptop and set about updating his Patrick Plan spreadsheet. Filed accounts with accountant, he typed in the business column. Sorted paperwork. Paid bills, he added, dating each entry. It was remarkably satisfying to see the new entries accumulating, each one small but valuable. Was it really only a week since he decided to embark on this plan? In that time, he'd so far chalked up 10 good deeds, which averaged out as 1.428 per day. Call it 1.43. Whichever, it felt like excellent progress, as if he was genuinely making a difference. In fact, if he carried on at this rate, over the next 2 months he'd have completed at least 80 Patrick-related tasks, and with each one, he hoped to lessen the pain and stress felt by Zoe and the kids. Wait, there was more. Lift 2 from Sculpture Club, he typed in the Ethan column, which made 11 Patrick deeds. Or should he count it as 2 separate jobs, he wondered, before deciding that was probably pushing it. His nephew had been more communicative this week, chatting about the work they were doing at the club and recounting a couple of anecdotes from his day at school over the crashing chords of another concerto. Did you and your dad listen to this sort of music together? Dan had asked during a break in the conversation, feeling curious. He couldn't picture it somehow. Turned out his instinct was correct. Ethan had snorted. You're joking, aren't you? Dad always said it was gay. Seriously? Dan asked, flummoxed. Meaning that classical music is gay, or that people who listen to it must be? Both. You know what he was like. Ethan lifted a shoulder as if he didn't care. Dan hadn't been entirely sure how to reply. Seems a bit small-minded, he commented eventually. He didn't want to badmouth his brother in front of his own kid, but calling a whole genre of music gay seemed like something from the Dark Ages. Also kind of pathetic. Yep, well, that was Dad, said Ethan. He thought art was pretty gay too. Me wanting to go to Sculpt Shed. What's wrong with you, lad? When I was your age, I was playing for the rugby team, not bending bits of wire together. His impression of Patrick was uncanny, and Dan cringed. God, he said, staring through the windscreen. Well, I don't think like that, and most people don't think like that. At all. He felt compelled to say. There was silence for a moment. You know, maybe he was just trying to push your buttons, wind you up a bit, he went on, wanting to give his brother the benefit of the doubt. Patrick wasn't a bigot after all. He really wasn't. Yeah, maybe, Ethan said, sounding unconvinced. And before Dan could think of anything else to say, they had arrived in Wandsworth, and Ethan was getting out of the car. On the way home, things were more convivial at least, with the two of them laughing companionably together about this and that. Patrick wasn't mentioned again. Arriving back in Kew, Dan pulled on the handbrake. Same time, same place next week, I take it? He asked. Oh, no, it's the Easter holidays next week. The club's closed for a fortnight. Damn it, thought Dan, picturing his schedule up on the fridge. He would fall behind with his numbers now. Unless... Maybe we could do something else together, he suggested. Go to Tate Modern, or if you want some sculpture inspiration, we could find some of the Henry Moores around London. It was gratifying to see his nephew's eyes light up in response. Yes, please, Ethan said at once. That would be cool. Great. I'll talk to your mum. Get something arranged, Dan told him before waving goodbye and driving off again. He felt warm inside all the way back to Hammersmith. Who knew that a child reacting to you with such obvious pleasure could feel so good? See, Patrick, I'm there for him, he thought. And guess what? I'm going to do loads of so-called gay art stuff with him, because he loves it, and so do I. So chew on that one for a bit, pal. Moving on, anyway, tomorrow he planned to spend the day clearing out the recently vacated flat on Whitecliff Road before painting it throughout. Friday, he would add a second coat of paint, finishing the job over the weekend if need be. Then he'd get back to the letting agent about renting it out to new tenants and boom! More money arriving in the business account for Zoe, thanks to him, as well as more good deeds totting up. The big question, though, and one he was struggling to get to grips with, was whether or not to include Lydia on the spreadsheet. He couldn't decide. Did meeting her count as something to be ticked off on Patrick's behalf? Theoretically, yes. But did it benefit Zoe in any way? No, absolutely not. In fact, quite the reverse, seeing as Dan had flip-flopped so abruptly on his initial plans. The sticking point was that he liked Lydia, he'd realised. His instinct was that she was a decent person, not someone grabby and out for what they could get. Listening to her account of things, it seemed she was more victim than villain in the situation. A woman who had been shoddily treated and deserved better. But hers was only one side of the story, he reminded himself, still unable to quite believe it. Maybe the truth hadn't actually been as black and white as she'd made out. Maybe, in fact, here came his imagination again, cranking into action. Maybe she tried to entrap Patrick, tricking him, lying to him, deliberately getting pregnant to try and force him apart from Zoe, or something. Or maybe, yes, this could be it. Maybe it had been a one-night stand, a foolish mistake that Patrick had been feeling terrible about ever since. And Lydia had embellished the whole thing, fantasized that they'd had some kind of relationship. But then he remembered how anxious her eyes had been, how sincere her shock and grief. Dan had only spent 30 minutes with her, yet he was pretty sure she wasn't a bunny boiler with a game plan. She looked as if she'd genuinely fallen in love with Patrick and had her heart broken, which meant that, oh bloody hell. He did believe her, that was the problem. His instinct was that she had been telling the truth. "What were you thinking, Patrick?" he groaned aloud. You weren't supposed to speak ill of the dead, but sometimes that was impossible when you discovered their darkest secrets. Perhaps this happened about everyone when they died, and the skeletons came tumbling forth from previously locked closets. You were left feeling shaken, as if maybe you hadn't known them as well as you thought. It was even more disconcerting when you'd spent your life looking up to that person, seeing them as someone to emulate. But for Patrick to behave as he had towards Lydia, it was really bad. Sleazy and just wrong. No wonder he had decided to keep the whole saga to himself. And no wonder also that Lydia had been so wary when Dan phoned her up and mentioned Patrick's name. Jesus. His fingers still hovered over the empty spreadsheet boxes while he tussled with the dilemma. Meeting Lydia, he typed, but then changed his mind almost immediately and backspaced through the letters again. He'd gone to meet her with the intention of resolving matters, but the situation didn't feel quite finished. To him, anyway. But she had been pretty fierce as she left, telling him in no uncertain terms that she didn't need any charity from him, then marching off. Would that really be the end of it? Although, of course, if it was, it would make life a damn sight easier for him, he figured. Problem solved. Direct debits stopped. Zoe never had to know. But then he remembered the business card on Zoe's fridge. He'd have to pocket it the next chance he got, to prevent any contact between them. Whatever happened, he must not let Zoe call Lydia. Imagine the fallout if Lydia blurted out the truth to her, told her everything. She'd seemed so wound up when she left the cafe. Dan had felt rattled ever since. Who knew what she was capable of? "You see," he complained aloud to his brother. "You see what a mess you've made of everything. You twat." His phone beeped just then, a text from his friend Steve. "Blue Anchor tonight, or we're staging an intervention. Come over, it's been too long. We'll be there from 8. Dan checked his watch to see that it was 7:45 already. Sod it, he was thirsty and Steve was right. He hadn't seen any of his mates for weeks. Plus, if he went on agonising about Lydia and Zoe all evening, he would lose the will to live. "Meeting Lydia," he typed, then set the spreadsheet printing before he could change his mind again. Done. If she wanted to draw a line under things, then that suited him just fine. "On my way," he texted back. The Blue Anchor was an 18th century pub on the riverside with good beers and even better chips. And as soon as Dan walked through the door 20 minutes or so later, he felt a wave of relief sweep over him. Pub, mates, beer. Conversation about sport, work, funny stories. Nothing bad could happen here. No difficult dilemmas to resolve, other than what to drink. And Christ, did that first pint taste good. "Someone's got a thirst on," commented Neil as Dan drained his glass. "Making up for lost time, aren't I?" Dan replied, getting up from the table. "Who wants what?" He was going to get wasted, he decided, as he ordered a round of whiskey chasers for everyone as well as their pints. He was going to drink and drink and drink until he stopped thinking about Patrick and Zoe and Lydia. Alcohol would blur them all away tonight. Bring it on. This plan worked for a time too. Really well, in fact. The four men had known each other since their school days and were able to veer into long, enjoyable reminiscences about events from 20 years ago, such as the night when, having taken a load of magic mushrooms, they reenacted the Abbey Road photo shoot, stark naked at 2 a.m. Or even further back, when they were in a chemistry lesson together and one of them, Neil thought it was Steve blamed Mark, had set fire to Victoria Postlethwaite's blazer with a Bunsen burner. And then they were into a round of, "What happened to?" starting with Victoria Postlethwaite herself, last seen working in a harvester, still as hot as a Bunsen burner, Mark reckoned. Before the conversation took a detour to football, then onto a heated discussion about chocolate bars of the 80s. It was exactly the kind of easygoing bollocks he needed, Dan thought, as he bought another round. His 5th, or was it 6th, pint, and the rest of the world was starting to soften around the edges, as if viewed through an old movie camera, slicked with Vaseline. "Cheers, boys," he said, feeling a sudden rush of love for them. Huge, boundless love for these men who had released all the stress and strain inside him with their banter and teasing. Neil with his daft buzz cut, which wasn't doing much to disguise his slowly vanishing hairline. Marky Mark with the same Pixies t-shirt he'd had for at least 2 decades and the loudest laugh in the room. Steve, once a proper goth with a dyed black Mohican and lip piercings, now a rotund dad of twin girls who'd recently taken them to some teeny bopper concert and realised to his horror that he knew all the words of the songs. Thank God for friends who came and scooped you up, who reminded you that the world could be all right, just when you'd forgotten how to laugh. "Cheers," they chorused. But then Steve, no doubt thinking he was being sensitive, felt the need to lift his pint again. "And to Patrick," he said solemnly. "To Patrick," the others chorused, drinks in the air. Dan felt his mood collapsing like a flicked house of cards. He didn't want Patrick at the table. Not tonight. Nah, he said. Let's not. Steve looked uncomfortable. Sorry, mate, he said. We don't have to talk about it. Well, he was a great bloke, wasn't he? But Dan no longer knew what to think about his brother, let alone how to respond. Lydia's hurt face rose in his mind, followed by poor Zoe's loving ignorance, and then he was flashing back to the argument he'd had with Patrick the night of his disappearance, feeling the gut punch all over again. The pure pain of betrayal. Not always, he replied thickly, the alcohol skidding through him. Turned out he wasn't always that great, you know. The others looked confused by this response, and afterwards the evening kind of fell away from Dan, without him ever being able to pick it back up. He was drinking faster and faster, as if his thirst would never be quenched. He was stumbling on his feet, crashing into the wall on the way to the gents, so hard that he'd have bruises on his arm for almost a week afterwards. He started arguing with Mark about, he couldn't even remember what, only that the other three all exchanged glances and then Neil said, "Taxi for Mr. Shepherd," and he didn't swing a punch, did he? God, he might have done. Anyway, the next thing he knew, the pub was closing and Mark was frog-marching him home. Dan vaguely remembered trying to shove him away, but Mark had a tight grip because he had started going to the gym loads when his wife left him 2 years ago, and Dan was too drunk to fight back properly. And then, oh no, he had the horrible feeling he started to cry right there in the street, telling Mark he was sorry and that everything had gone wrong. Then there was a gap, a blank in his memory, and they were back at Mark's flat, not his, and Mark was putting him in the spare room. The next morning when he woke up, head jangling, mouth like the Sahara, he realised he must have thrown up in his sleep because there was vomit all over the floor and down the side of the bed. He lay there, stinking and sweaty, as moments from the night before smashed into his memory like blows to the head. Rock bottom all over again, he thought miserably. Every time he felt as if he was inching out of despair, down he tumbled once more, all the way to the depths. His stomach churned, bile rose. He only just managed to get out of bed and sprint to the bathroom before he was sick again. Shivering and clammy, he remembered that he was supposed to be painting the flat on White Cliff Road today, and didn't know whether to laugh or cry, or vomit once more. "I suppose you think this is funny," he growled to Patrick between retches. Chapter 14. Thursday morning was cool and grey, the sky almost pearly in the east as the sun tried to break through the cloud cover. Ethan had left the house in a bad mood, having discovered that Zoe had forgotten to wash his rugby kit. "What do you even do all day?" he'd snapped at her, stuffing his still muddy shirt into his bag with a kind of fury. Half an hour later, setting out with Gabe and Bea towards the primary school, Zoe still felt tightly wound, with Ethan's criticism continuing to echo through her head. What do you even do all day? As if he felt nothing but contempt for her inadequacy. He was grieving, she reminded herself, and this was yet another sign that things had changed, that she was not the organised, capable mum she had been 2 months ago. She was a mess, and they both knew it. This didn't really make her feel any better, on second thoughts. "Mummy," said Bea, swinging her book bag as they walked along. "Do you think there are unicorns in heaven?" No," Gabe answered scathingly before Zoe could find an appropriate answer. "'Cause unicorns aren't real, Dumbo, and neither is heaven. It's just a story for little kids and religious people." "Gabe," scolded Zoe, "don't call her names, and don't say that about heaven." "Why not?" he challenged. Do you believe in heaven? Because I haven't seen any proof that it even exists, like photos or maps or anything. So how does anyone actually know? They were walking past a bus stop at that moment, and a stout middle-aged woman waiting there caught Zoe's eye, but not in a good way. She was wearing a badge that said, Jesus is love, and Zoe hustled the children past her fast, in case the woman was tempted to join the conversation. I don't have proof, Gabe, because I haven't been there myself, but lots of people believe that it... I think Daddy would like to meet a unicorn, Bea put in serenely, chewing the end of her plait as Zoe floundered mid-sentence. They could be friends. I'm going to call his unicorn Snowdrop because she's all white and pretty. Lovely, said Zoe weakly, giving up on the heaven answer. Not real, not real, not real, Gabe taunted his sister. Bea glared at him. They are real, and me and Mummy are going to see a film about them on Saturday in the cinema, so there. Real, she retorted, stabbing her brother with her finger for good measure. Gabe gave the scathing laugh of a 9-year-old who knew absolutely everything. Yeah, a cartoon, he scoffed. It's not like a documentary about unicorns. Duh. That's enough, Zoe said, wishing that her children, particularly this gobby middle one, wouldn't take such enormous glee from winding each other up. Gabe was still in goading mode, though, cackling at his own superiority. Did you actually think it was going to be a wildlife film with, David Attenborough standing there with a bunch of... He could hardly get the words out for laughing so much. With a bunch of unicorns. Bea's face darkened, never a good sign. Then she stopped dead in the street with her hands on her hips. Right, I'm telling Daddy about this now, she announced, before gazing up at the sky, her little chin sticking out. Daddy, did you see that? He's being mean. Tell him. In the very next second, a car horn beeped, loud and indignant, as if answering her command, and Bea's eyes grew round at the sound. See? She exclaimed, vindicated. That was him telling you to stop. She went right up in her brother's face. Beep, she yelled, then skipped off along the pavement. Thanks, Daddy, Zoe heard her say. Gabe glanced across at Zoe, looking chastened. That wasn't Dad, he said, but you could hear the uncertainty in his voice. Zoe shrugged. Who knows, she said lightly. Maybe Patrick was more willing to offer a sign to Bea than he was to her, to dish out a warning beep here and there to keep Gabe in check. He'd always stuck up for his daughter in the past when the boy's teasing tipped over into unkindness after all, and it wouldn't hurt Gabe to think twice about his behaviour. She put a consoling hand on his shoulder. Anyway, look on the bright side, she reminded him. You're going to play with Jack on Saturday, aren't you? So you don't have to see the unicorn film with us. Could be worse, right? Once Zoe had seen the children safely into the school playground, she walked back down the road. I take it you're still not replying to me, she muttered aloud, staring up at the sky like Bea had done. There was no corresponding beep from any vehicles, though. No sudden burst of sunshine, no sparrow nodding meaningfully at her from the nearest tree. No acknowledgement whatsoever. In your own time, she added. She was being fanciful, she told herself, as she walked further along. As fanciful as her 6-year-old daughter, who at least had an excuse for it. This was not really dealing with it. This was a blatant coping mechanism, a means of kidding herself that he was still around somewhere, amidst the chilly April morning air, able to hear her. Moreover, it was a coping mechanism that didn't even work properly, seeing as she never got anything back from him. Still, talking to Patrick was clearly helping Bea, at least. Zoe had heard her chatting away after her bedtime the night before, and when Zoe put her head round the bedroom door to remind Bea that she was supposed to be going to sleep, her daughter had replied, "I'm just telling Daddy a bedtime story, in case he's missing me." The room was dark, save for the toadstool lamp beside the bed, which glowed softly pink, but Zoe could make out the little girl's smile through the shadows, pleased with her own kindness. It was enough to crack a person's heart in two. How could she deny Bea this one-sided conversation? Besides, it kept Patrick real for her. It kept him a part of her life, which could only be a good thing. She didn't feel like going straight home this morning. She had found that the act of walking through her own front door often sapped her energy and left her unable to do very much other than wander mournfully around the empty rooms, occasionally sinking onto one of the children's beds and putting her head in her hands. "What do you even do all day?" Ethan had sneered. And the honest answer these days was, not much. His words still smarting in her head, she found herself veering towards the cemetery, which was a fitting place for a widow, she supposed. "Hello," she whispered as she walked through the gates. She and Patrick had never explicitly discussed their preferences in death, blithely assuming they would have decades left together before they needed to consider such things. But when it came to making decisions about his funeral and other arrangements, she had known instinctively that he would not have wanted to be buried. He was tall and outdoorsy and had never liked being confined in small spaces. Lifts, budget hotel bathrooms, small cars, they all gave him the heebie-jeebies. It was silly of her. He was dead, after all, and technically unable to care much either way. But she couldn't bear the thought of him in a coffin, buried under the ground. She'd opted for cremation instead, and currently had what was left of him in a small urn on top of the wardrobe. "I can't leave him on the mantelpiece or anywhere downstairs," she'd had to tell Liz, after her mother-in-law had hinted several times about keeping Patrick's ashes somewhere more visible. "The kids will only knock him over and spill him everywhere." Her own mum wasn't entirely happy that Zoe was still holding on to the urn either. "You really should scatter those ashes," she had said more than once. "It might help, love. Letting him go." "I will. I'm going to," Zoe had said. "Don't rush me." That pot of ashes was all she had left of her husband. She wanted his final send-off to be perfect. She was planning to bring him on holiday to Pembrokeshire with them that summer anyway. Take a walk along the headland with the kids and let him fly with the wind as she gave her eulogy and they talked about their fondest memories of him. Patrick loved holidaying there, they both did. They'd gone a couple of years ago, staying in a house right on the beach at Freshwater East, and it had been one of the happiest weeks of her life. She liked the thought of him resting there. That was all ahead of her, though. In the meantime, she had paid for a memorial plaque with his name on in the Garden of Remembrance, here in the grounds of the cemetery, and it was a peaceful place to visit. The flower beds were beautifully tended, with the cherry trees just coming into bloom. There were benches to sit on too, if you felt like lingering a while, and the calm kind of hush that made the rest of the world seem far distant. Patrick Christopher Shepherd was a loving father, husband and son, she murmured to herself as she walked along. A kind, honest man who we all adored. Such a wonderful father, the best of all men, the best man in the world. It was no good. Every time she tried to sum him up for her eulogy, the words felt inadequate. How could a few bland phrases do justice to the years they had shared together? The way that all of his tiny kindnesses and acts of love had built up in tissue-thin layers to create something solid and indestructible. She still missed him so much all the time. She missed his easy company, his whistling around the house, his habit of pulling her to him in an embrace, the knack he had of making her feel better, whatever kind of day he'd had. Even after Bee's birth, when Zoe had been stunned by an unexpected cloud of postnatal depression that had brought her to her knees, Patrick had been able to reach her, the only person who still managed to connect with her in that fearful, shadowy place. He'd taken her hand and not let go until he'd helped pull her through the darkness. She held her hands up in front of her now, wishing he was still here to clasp one within his warm, friendly fingers, to hook an arm around her shoulders and let her lean against him, to make her laugh with the story about one of his tenants, or something one of the lads at work had said, or... "Zoe? Are you all right?" Oh, shit. There was Mary, one of the mums from school, on the path, presumably having just heard Zoe muttering her eulogy under her breath like a weirdo, while holding up her hands and staring at them. Imagine if this got round the school playground. It would spread faster than melted butter. She's obviously not handling it well, talking to herself in the cemetery like a fruitcake. It's not a good look, is it? Poor woman. I hope the children are okay. Do you think someone should have a word? "Zoe," Mary prompted. She was wearing a gorgeous pale blue coat that made her look like some kind of ice queen. Zoe registered distractedly before snapping to attention. "Yes, sorry, miles away," she said. "Yes, I'm fine, thanks. Are you?" "Not bad," said Mary, although the wind was making her eyes run and she dabbed at them suddenly. "Listen, maybe we should have a chat sometime. Get together. It would be good to talk." "Oh," said Zoe, feeling uncomfortable. "I'm not sure." She already felt so talked about. That was the problem. She'd removed herself from a couple of parents' WhatsApp groups recently because she couldn't cope with other people's comments and clumsy approaches, however well-meaning. What did they know about grief? How many of them had had to deal with the death of a husband? They had no idea, and clearly neither did Mary, if she thought Zoe wanted to chat about her feelings. "I'm not much company right now, but thanks anyway." She made her goodbyes and hurried away, trying to keep a lid on her emotions. One day she'd feel normal again, she comforted herself. One day she'd be able to make conversation like the other mums, drop round for coffee with them, eat cake and swap funny stories about their children. But not yet. Not today. Right now, all she could manage was putting one foot in front of another, in order to trudge along through each minute and hour. "You're doing great," she told herself fiercely. "Mary's not important. Just keep going." Chapter 15. On Friday evening, Dan was gazing at his good deeds spreadsheet, in particular the blank spaces in the Gabe and B columns, when Zoe rang. "I know it's short notice, but I don't suppose you could have Gabe for a few hours tomorrow, could you?" she asked. He was meant to be spending the day with his friend Jack, but Jack's brother fell off the climbing frame at the park and has fractured his wrist. They're operating first thing in the morning. I'm a bit stuck now because Ethan's out doing a workshop at the Tate, and I promised B ages ago we'd go to see some terrible unicorn movie that Gabe would rather die than watch, so "It's fine, I can have him," Dan said, when she paused for breath. It was as if fate had made an intervention right there. He was not about to refuse Zoe anything, not least because of the extra guilt he'd been carrying around since meeting Lydia. The still to be resolved "what the hell am I going to do" guilt, which was becoming more onerous with every day that passed. He was feeling so queasy about the whole thing that he'd probably have agreed to commit a series of crimes on Zoe's behalf if she went on to request such a list. "Whenever you like," he added for good measure. Zoe exhaled with noisy relief, and the sound of it made Dan feel better. Needed. This was the first time she had specifically asked him for help since Patrick's death, perhaps ever, now that he thought about it. She had come to him, and he had been able to say yes. Plus, hadn't he just been thinking that he needed to find something he and Gabe could do together? "Oh, thank you," Zoe sighed. "Thanks so much. I really appreciate this." "No problem. What time do you want me to get him?" He was positively jaunty by now. "The middle of the night? 5 in the morning? I'll do it. You want me to walk to your place barefoot along a path of burning coals and broken glass? Absolutely." "About 10, is that okay? Sorry, I hope you're not having to rearrange anything around us or change your plans." "No, not at all," he assured her. This wasn't entirely true. He'd planned on finishing painting the White Cliff Road flat on Saturday, it having taken far longer than he'd anticipated, admittedly, largely because he'd been so hungover on Thursday that he'd hardly been able to open the emulsion bucket without retching. Today had been more productive at least, but there was still all the woodwork left to gloss and, well, never mind, there would be time on Sunday. 10 is fine, he said. I'll think of something fun we can do together. Oh gosh, don't feel you have to. You can stay in the house and play computer games all morning with him, if you'd rather. Whatever's easiest, Dan. How was it possible to feel simultaneously pleased by another person's gratitude, yet also sick to the stomach with shame at your double crossing? Whatever. Dan was absolutely not about to cop out and play computer games with his nephew, when he could seize the opportunity to be super uncle and kind brother-in-law. Leave it with me, he said. See you tomorrow morning. That grandiose sort of posturing was what had led to Dan now shepherding an extremely excited Gabe towards his first skateboarding lesson at a skate park just off the Westway. Gabe liked dangerous activities. He was a bold, reckless and well-coordinated boy. The moment Dan had seen skateboarding come up in his fun things to do with your nephew internet search, he had thought, bingo. Okay, so Zoe didn't look completely thrilled by the prospect when Dan arrived earlier and made his big announcement. She had turned a little pale, if anything, and started talking anxiously about broken bones. But unfortunately for her, Dan had made the rookie error of airing his suggestion in front of Gabe as well, resulting in a whoop of yes from the boy, followed by a frenzy of karate kicks and kapow noises around the kitchen. It would have taken an utter killjoy to forbid the trip now, and so Zoe had dubiously agreed, albeit with pleas to return her son in one piece, rather than in an injured mash. Fancy having a go yourself? The instructor joked to Dan when they arrived and set about registering Gabe and hiring the necessary kit. Dan was about to laugh and say, No thanks, I value my limbs, when Gabe looked up at him, eyes shining, and said, Do you, Uncle Dan? Oh, go on. When was the last time anyone had looked at him like that? As if he were a king or a rock star, someone important. Here was his nephew specifically asking for his company, flattering him with hopefulness. Was it any wonder Dan heard himself replying, sure, okay, without properly thinking about what he might be letting himself in for? In hindsight, this was rookie error number 2. No turning back now. 5 minutes later, they were both rigged up in brightly coloured helmets, elbow and knee pads, and choosing their skateboards, before being greeted by a terrifyingly young instructor called Aki. Oh shit. Dan was already regretting his decision to take part. Was it too late to backtrack? All around them, kids in hoodies and skate pants were whizzing up and down ramps of varying sizes and gradients, leaping and twisting in mid-air from the half-pipe and, most alarming of all, rattling along steep rails with apparent ease. It was a massive place, with indoor and outdoor sections, a skate shop and a cafe, which looked particularly tempting right now. Damn it. Having been guided to the beginners area, an almost entirely flat section of the skate park that was shunned by anyone over the age of 8, they waited for Aki, who had stopped to backslap a couple of moon-faced teens in oversized tartan shirts. Gabe fidgeted with barely contained excitement, stepping from foot to foot, eyes wide with the thrill of so many cool kids in the vicinity. "This is awesome," he breathed happily. "Too right," Dan agreed, trying to mask his sudden rush of dread with a stern talking to. "Here we are, uncle and nephew, and we're going to have a great time," he reminded himself. "We are cementing a new bond together. We're starting something really good that will last forever. I am stepping into the role of number 1 male adult in his life, and I will not fuck this up." What was it he'd heard Ethan mutter that first time in the car? Something like, "puts the tit in substitute." Well, he wouldn't be doing that either. He glanced up at the sky. It wasn't as if he believed in an afterlife, but he liked the thought of Patrick looking down and seeing them here together, appreciating the expression of utter joy on Gabe's face, and maybe chalking up a tick for Dan. Dan found himself thinking of the photos by his nephew's bed, of Gabe and Patrick together at various football matches. Patrick had always been sure-footedly sporty, able to catch and throw and kick with skill. It was obvious that Gabe had inherited the same physical competence. If Dan was ever going to attempt to compensate for the loss of Patrick, then this was the least he could do. He must not let the kid down. "Okay, guys," Aki said, clapping his hands together. He was short but stocky, with insane muscles rippling through his shoulders whenever he moved, dressed in a thin hooded top and baggy shorts, his feet in massive dark blue Nikes, the exact name of which Dan felt he was 20 years too old and not nearly cool enough to know. Gabe immediately fell silent, staring up at Aki with something bordering on love, or at least massive great crush. Dan was not one to cast aspersions on under-10s, but he felt quietly confident that his nephew never gave the teachers at school such devout attention. "Let's get started," Aki said. "First up, how to stand on your board." He elbowed Gabe with a wink. "We'll see who's better, shall we? You or the old guy?" Dan prickled all over at being called the old guy, but Gabe sniggered disloyally. "That's my Uncle Dan," he said, blushing with the honour of speaking to his new hero. "Uncle Dan, hey?" Aki grinned and raised an eyebrow at Dan, who couldn't quite bring himself to grin back. Wanker. He tried to pull a face that said, "Yeah, whatever, I'm not intimidated by you," but felt his teeth baring in more of a snarl. "Okay," said Aki, clapping his hands together. "So, standing on the board, 1 foot in front of the other, yeah? Most people like to have their left foot at the front so that the right can do all the pushing. But it's up to you. There's no right or wrong way about it. See how I'm keeping my back foot at an angle? That helps my balance. You try it for me now, little dude." Gabe stepped confidently onto the skateboard, following Aki's instructions. There was a slight wobble and a brief arm flail, but then the boy found his balance with a triumphant grin. "Easy," his face said. "Boom!" cried Aki, reaching over for a high five. He was already getting on Dan's wick. "Now your turn, Uncle Dan. Let's see what you've got." Patronising twat. Dan stepped onto the board, praying it wasn't about to roll away beneath him or tip up or anything embarrassing. 1 foot in front of the other. There. What was all the fuss about? He was only raised 2 inches off the ground. Big deal. "No sweat," said Aki. "Cool as a cucumber. Okay, now let's get moving. I'm going to push off with my back foot, slow and strong, and we'll walk the boards around for a little while. Like so, see? Hey, you paying attention there, Uncle D?" "Sure," said Dan, momentarily distracted by the sight of a small girl with plaits poking out from a pink baseball cap. Seeing her had made him think about Lydia's daughter, this unexpected niece he'd just discovered he had. And then his thoughts had turned to Lydia herself, and her pale, anxious face frowning at him over her coffee. What should he do? He fretted for the 100th time, as Aki demonstrated how to scoot along on the skateboard, and he and Gabe followed behind. Their fraught conversation had nagged away at him since then. How he wished he could have handled the situation better. How he wished, moreover, that he had remained ignorant of Lydia's existence altogether. But the genie was out of the bottle now, and there was no way of persuading it back in there. Anyway, he needed to concentrate. Satisfied that his pupils could competently walk a skateboard along, Aki now wanted the two of them to shift into the riding position with both feet on the board. Back straight, knees a little bent, find your balance, he ordered, sailing around them in a wide loop on his own board to demonstrate. But then his attention was dragged elsewhere and he whistled under his breath. Back in a minute, guys, he said, before skating across the park towards a young woman with a swingy black ponytail and a heart-shaped bottom encased by tight white jeans. Look, Uncle Dan, I'm doing it, Gabe crowed with breathless glee, having pushed off. He rocked perilously backwards and forwards for a moment, arms windmilling, before righting himself. I'm skateboarding! Nice one, Dan cheered, glad to see his nephew so happy and excited. When he thought back to how peevish the boy had been the other week, winding up his brother, surly to Zoe and glued to the computer game he was playing, it was like looking at a different child altogether. Check this out, Patrick. Are you watching? I'm doing good here, I swear. Flushed with self-congratulation, he hopped on his own board, wanting to share the moment, only to lose his balance almost immediately. It was harder than it looked, and he'd pushed off too strongly to control what was happening beneath his feet. Whoa, he cried, desperately trying to maintain equilibrium. But then somehow or other he was tipping over and falling, and as he put his right foot down, his ankle rolled under with a sickening crunch. Fuck! Uncle Dan, said Gabe in shocked delight, coming to an abrupt stop. Uncle Dan, I heard that. Pain was shooting around Dan's body like pinballs in a machine, and he was unable to speak for a moment. Breath hissed out from between his clenched teeth as he lowered himself to a sitting position on the floor, clutching his wrenched ankle. Shit, had he broken it? He was in agony. Fuck. He could practically hear Patrick laughing at him from wherever he was watching. Wait, no, that wasn't Patrick. It was actually Aki, racing back to them. What the... roared the man-child. Are you kidding me? I turn my back for 2 minutes and you go and injure yourself, D. He squatted next to Dan and prodded the ankle knowingly. We're gonna need some ice here, a whole bag of ice. He looked up at Gabe. You okay, kid? Hey, don't worry. Happens all the time, especially to the old guys. You're not gonna hurt yourself though, right? Gabe's expression of glee had turned to one that looked very much like embarrassment. Mm-hmm, he said, eyes hooded, his gaze flicking to Dan and back. Oh God, thought Dan, picturing the scene from above. All the cool, edgy kids whizzing around fearlessly, while the middle-aged has-been lay crippled and contorted on the cold concrete floor. This was not the fun experience he had planned for either of them. Ice, said Aki again, rising to his feet. And a chair. You'll live, don't worry, he added, as he hurried off. When Zoe got home later, she found Dan sitting there with one foot up, ice pack resting on his ankle, while Gabe eagerly told her about his lesson in a single unceasing sentence without taking a breath. She didn't know whether to laugh or cry. or whether she should just roll her eyes up to the ceiling and yell, "I could have told you this was a stupid idea from the start." Okay, so she felt a grudging amount of sympathy for Dan, who was white-faced with pain and looking very sorry for himself, as Gabe regaled them with full details of his glories on the skateboard. But her overriding reaction was one of exasperation. Because nobody had forced Dan to go along to the skate park in the first place, had they? Certainly nobody had insisted that he have a go himself. And now Gabe was hyped up with his exciting new pursuit, and guess who was going to have to be the mug who took him along from now on? Zoe. That was who. Zoe, who already had a million other things to be dealing with, and who was only surprised that reckless Gabe hadn't been the one to break a bone or rip a ligament. When she had already lost one member of the family and was trying her hardest to keep the rest of them safe from harm. Marvellous. Just marvellous. "Sounds fun," she said, taking off her shoes, feeling lightheaded as she bent down. She'd had another poor night's sleep, and following her mornings spent watching the god-awful unicorn movie with Bea, she wanted nothing more than to sit for 5 minutes on her own and drink a cup of tea in peace, eyes shut, zoning out. It appeared she might have to wait a while before such a thing was possible. Great," she murmured, when Gabe finally paused for breath. Then she got a grip on herself. "Coffee, Dan?" she asked, feeling bad for her churlish thoughts when the guy was only doing her a favour after all. "Make an effort, Zoe." "Do you need me to take you to the walking clinic? Have someone look at that?" she asked, mentally crossing her fingers that the rest of the day wouldn't be spent in a noisy A&E waiting room. "Were you able to drive back okay?" "He did swear a few times in the car," said Gabe, the snitch. "You did though, Uncle Dan," he added, when Dan shot him a reproachful look. "Sorry," mumbled Dan, hobbling through to the kitchen after her. "Braking was kind of painful," he admitted. "But it's just a twist, nothing serious. Might even teach me to remember my age. Coffee would be great, please." Zoe felt herself soften a little. "Thanks for taking him. You know, I bet Patrick would have done exactly the same thing. Exactly. In fact, he'd probably have come home having bought them each a skateboard and all the gear." She shook her head affectionately, finding it all too easy to imagine the scene. Patrick had always launched into new hobbies with the greatest enthusiasm, as the rowing machine, ice cream maker, and box kites still gathering dust in the cellar could testify. Dan's face cleared at her comment. She would go so far as to say that he actually looked delighted. "Really? So I was just doing what Patrick would have done?" "God, yeah," she laughed. "Sometimes I wasn't sure who was the biggest kid in the family. Do sit down," she added, glancing back from the mug cupboard to see him hovering awkwardly by the fridge. "Keep the weight off that foot." They made chit-chat while the kettle boiled, and Zoe felt her tension start to ebb away. She had always liked Dan after all. He was a good guy, even if, like his brother, he sometimes rushed into a so-called great new idea without actually thinking it through. He told her about painting one of Patrick's flats and how he was getting to know the tenants from wading through the backlog of all their recent complaints. She hadn't realised quite how hard he had been working on their behalf, and her heart swelled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said humbly, adding milk to his coffee. "That's really good of you. Obviously, let me know how much I owe you for the paint and everything. I've been meaning to log into the business account and start getting to grips with it, so having to transfer some money over to you will force me to pull my finger out." His eyes darted away for some reason, though. "Oh, don't worry, it's fine. You've got enough on your plate," he said. "As if. I'm not having you paying out of your own pocket," she told him, passing his mug over. "In fact, wait there. she added, digging in her purse and getting out the company credit card Patrick had given her. Use this for anything you buy online from now on, okay? And save any other receipts for me so that I can settle up. By the way, I've been meaning to ask, was all the paperwork there with the accounts? I know you said you were going to sort out the VAT return. I hope everything was in order. She smiled at him. No dodgy payments, I take it? Patrick not up to anything naughty behind my back? She'd intended the questions to be light-hearted. She was joking, but Dan spluttered on his coffee at her words. Was she going mad, or did a weird expression flash across his face even? He said, raking a hand through his hair. Dan, I'm kidding, she laughed, although she couldn't help peering at him, wondering why he was hesitating like that. Her laugh died away as confusion set in. Everything all right? He shook his head, recovering himself. Yes, all fine. The accounts, of course. My mind went blank for a moment. I was thinking about my own accounts, forgot I'd even taken a look at Patrick's. Yes, no problems, very straightforward. I've sent everything off to the accountant, just waiting to hear what's owed on the VAT. He was talking quickly, seemingly keen to convince her, but Zoe wasn't fooled, not for an instant. The hair on her arms stood up on end, her mouth becoming dry as he continued in this poor, rambling attempt at covering up. But what was he covering up? Was there something untoward about Patrick's paperwork? Before she could investigate further, he had already changed the subject to an idea he'd had about taking Ethan to see some sculptures over the school holidays, and began reeling off a list of ones that were scattered around the capital. From a Barbara Hepworth piece on Oxford Street to a Rodin at Westminster Palace, and she found herself caught up in his enthusiasm. Yes, Ethan would be thrilled to have his uncle taking this level of interest in him. Then Dan was offering to take Bea out on her bike, because Gabe had mentioned that this was something she and Patrick had always done together. And Zoe's eyes became quite moist with a rush of gratitude, followed immediately by guilt. She wasn't managing to do enough for them. She was still dragging herself through life like a zombie, performing the basic functions but little more. She reprimanded herself. What do you even do all day? She heard Ethan jeer again. Meanwhile, here was Dan, taking care of Patrick's landlording on top of his own life, and still managing to add a bit of flavour and excitement to her family. Thank you, she said humbly. They'd love those ideas. Must try harder. Must find the energy, she told herself, as he finished his coffee and hobbled out of the front door. She'd plan a trip to her mum's, she decided, on the spur of the moment. Maybe for Easter weekend. Cheer everyone up a bit at the seaside, not least her own self. It was only later on that her thoughts returned to the strangeness of her and Dan's earlier exchange about the accounts. How he'd faltered and stiffened, every inch a guilty reaction. What, exactly, had Dan been hiding? Or was she better off not knowing? Don't think I've forgotten, she muttered to herself with a frown.
This is the end of CD 5. The book continues on CD 6. CD 6.
Chapter 16. You did what? Are you crazy? Bridget had all but shrieked to Lydia when she came over for the full story of the Dan encounter a few evenings ago. You told him, wait, let me get this straight. You told him you didn't need any more money from Jemima's dad. You said that. Lydia put her head in her hands, unable to bear her friend's appalled reaction. Don't, she begged. I know it was stupid. I just lost my cool. You lost your cool. Yeah, and now you've lost your income, you pillock. How will you manage now? The question had barely left Lydia's head all weekend. Money management was something she'd really had to work at, which was why she was so furious with herself for refusing Dan's offer in a misplaced fit of pride. Dread sank through her whenever she tried to work out what she and Jemima would do without Patrick's monthly contribution, what they would need to sacrifice. She kept finding herself glancing over her possessions, as if pricing them up to sell. TV, laptop, bike. It wasn't like she lived a lavish lifestyle by any means. What might she get? A few £100 for the lot? That would vanish with the next gas bill. So how else could she scale down their costs? Jemima's gym classes were one of their biggest expenses, but Lydia would rather find herself a second job or take out a loan than tell her daughter she had to give them up. No way. Maybe the two of them could start sharing her bedroom and let Jemima's room out to a lodger. But who? And how would Jemima feel about this? She'd hate it. So would Lydia. Otherwise, they could look for somewhere smaller and cheaper to live, she supposed. Maybe move further out of London. But that would be such an upheaval. So much stress to bear alone, especially if Jemima then had to change school and all the rest of it. Take on another job? She might have to. Perhaps something she could do at home in the evenings. Admin tasks or envelope stuffing or... There had to be some way round the problem, surely. Otherwise she'd end up back at her dad's again, like a washed-up failure. She couldn't bring herself to go there a second time. Clearing up once Jemima was in bed on Sunday evening, her gaze drifted miserably to the small framed piece of paper that lived on the kitchen wall where she could see it every day. One of the most precious things Lydia owned. She had found it after her mother died. A crumpled list she must have compiled back when there were still dreams and plans to be made for the future. Favourite places to take Liddy, the title read in Eleanor's gorgeous, swoopy handwriting, followed by a series of entries detailing her most beloved Sydney beach, the cafe where she'd been a Saturday waitress, the sewing shop where she'd bought her vintage fabric and honed her dressmaking skills, the house she'd grown up in and other vital stops along the way. An adventure, just us two, her mum had promised her, and Lydia had kept the list as a talisman, vowing that one day she'd make it there with Jemima and they would see all of the sights in her mother's memory. Except they wouldn't be going there anytime soon, now that her finances were about to be decimated, obviously. God, she wished her mum hadn't died. Not only so that they could hang out on Bronte Beach together or revisit Eleanor's other old haunts, but so that Lydia could ask her what to do, turn to her for some much-needed advice. Now let's think this through together, Eleanor had always said, whether they were discussing Lydia's first crush as a plump 12-year-old or choosing which subjects to study in the sixth form. There was something about being taken seriously that Lydia always found thrilling, as if she mattered, was important. Not that it happened very often these days, mind you. She did her best, but sometimes she felt as if she was destined to be a nobody, or at least nobody special. She dried her hands and poured a glass of wine, trying to be positive. Maybe this was actually the shot in her arm she'd been waiting for, she told herself. Her chance to be a bit braver and push herself forward for a better paid and more interesting job. Working in the shop was easy and had been a useful first step back into employment, but it wasn't exactly what she wanted to do for the rest of her life. There must be other, more lucrative options open to her. Perhaps in time she'd look back at this as a turning point in her life, where she took the wheel and steered herself boldly in a whole new direction. Why not? Sipping her wine, she began scrolling through the list of part-time jobs available on a recruitment agency website. Okay, so on a first glance there appeared to be a lot of driving vacancies. Also a ton of telesales opportunities. Some shift work at a processing plant. Processing what? Cleaning jobs? Nothing exciting was really leaping out at her, it had to be said. Yet, she told herself bracingly, nothing exciting yet. Maybe if she adjusted the filters, it would help narrow things down. She went through and unticked every category of job except one marked creative, then clicked search and scanned the results. Telesales in an ad agency, an administrator for a theatre, a PA role at a business magazine company, an internship within a gallery, travel expenses paid, read the ad, as if that would make up for the apparent lack of salary on offer. Waiting staff for a hotel near Heathrow. And that was it. Nothing that would fit in with her single mum setup and, perhaps more to the point, nothing that called out to her. Spirit sinking, she chastised herself for ever thinking this might be easy, as if her dream job would even be available to her. Wanted, costume designer for West End Theatre. We pay really well and we'll help you sort out any childcare issues, and don't mind if you don't actually have any proper experience. Can you work a sewing machine and sketch cool outfits? Do you love clothes of all kinds? Then you're our woman. Or man, obviously, because we are fair like that. Call us. Yeah, right. Meanwhile, back in the real world, she was looking at minimum wage jobs, unsatisfying roles and long hours across town. That was if she was qualified for them in the first place, she realised, noticing that even the internship required applicants to have a university degree. They probably didn't want someone who had failed their A-levels and was dyslexic and actually pretty rubbish at maths. Would Jonathan even give her a decent reference? He was always teasing her about how disorganised she was, how flaky. Just the other day, she had been about to sell a beautiful vase to a customer for £6 rather than 60 because she typed the number in wrong. If it hadn't been for the customer pointing out the mistake, she wouldn't even have noticed. Panic was starting to set in and she forced herself to get a grip. Okay, think, Lydia. She could take on some evening work to tackle at home while Jemima slept. Data entry, call centre stuff, customer service. As she removed the search filters again and scrolled down and down, her optimism crumbled even more. There had to be something else she could do, which would fit in with Jemima and her home life. But if that job existed, she sure as hell wasn't seeing it on this website. Despair enveloped her like a toxic cloud. Why couldn't she manage to be a proper grown-up like everyone else? Sometimes she felt as if she was still that 17-year-old girl sobbing at her mother's funeral, as if a part of her had broken that day and she'd never quite managed to move on, blossom into an adult. She must be emotionally stunted or something, because she'd never even managed to have a proper loving relationship, apart from Patrick, and look at how that had turned out. What was wrong with her? Why was she so bad at adulthood? She closed the laptop feeling shaky. More to the point, without the money from Patrick, she and Jemima could be in all sorts of trouble. What was to become of them? Chapter 17. Dan's ankle was thankfully much better by Monday, and as he sat eating breakfast that morning, he felt relatively cheerful as he considered the last few days. His good deeds spreadsheet had a whole new crop of entries, acting as tiny individual validations. The flat on Whitecliff Road was newly painted throughout and ready to be let again. It had been raining overnight, but the sun was shining once more, casting golden streaks of light on the last wet drops that speckled the windows. He topped up the bird feeder recently, and it now provided a buffet to a whole host of feathered visitors. He watched them as he ate, appreciating the free show. Back when he'd been an office drone, he'd never had time to sit and contemplate anything other than the news on his phone, or the list of meetings he had lined up that day, before heading out the door. A different sort of agenda lay ahead of him this week. There had been 3 new calls waiting for him when he checked the messages on Patrick's business phone earlier, all from Rosemary, his most demanding tenant. Apparently her burglar alarm had started flashing at 6 o'clock that morning and still hadn't stopped. It almost certainly meant that the battery was on its way out and needed replacing. But she had sounded increasingly worried with each message, and he had a feeling that the calls would keep coming until he went to deal with it. That was first on the list. Later, he needed to chase up Patrick's accountant about the VAT bill. He cringed anew as he remembered Zoe asking, all innocence, about dodgy payments from Patrick's account. He was pretty sure he'd managed to bluster through a response without arousing her suspicions, but nevertheless, it had felt a perilous moment before he'd eventually twigged that she was joking. He hadn't yet decided what to do about the direct debit due to go out to Lydia next week, but he'd managed to swipe the business card with Lydia's details from Zoe's fridge at least, pocketing it surreptitiously while she was making him a coffee, so he had prevented one horrendous phone call at least. The card was on the kitchen table in front of him now, like a ticking bomb, and he picked it up and turned it between his fingers, corner by corner, still unsure what, if anything, he should do. Soft, read the logo on the card, followed by a W4 address, the Turnham Green end of Chiswick according to the map on his phone. Lydia had written her name and phone number on the card, plus a little heart. Curious, he glanced at the website, discovering that it was a small arty boutique, apparently owned by a Jonathan Browning. Lydia's husband or partner, maybe? Did she own the business or just work there? If the latter, then he doubted that she was being paid a huge amount of money. Maybe she was an heiress or had a massive trust fund or had married someone stinking rich and therefore didn't need maintenance money from Patrick. But having met her, Lydia didn't strike him as someone who led an opulent lifestyle. The phone on which she'd shown him photos of Jemima, for instance, was not a top-of-the-range new model, he seemed to remember. He was pretty sure she hadn't been wearing a wedding ring either, and she definitely hadn't mentioned any kind of partner, wealthy and shop-owning or not. Women tended to do that when they wanted to make very clear that they were not into you, in Dan's experience. He put his phone back down, thinking. Patrick might have betrayed Zoe emotionally, but in practical terms he had been very thorough about providing for her and the children. The life insurance he'd arranged had paid out a substantial amount on his passing. The rest of the mortgage cleared in an instant, and lump sums were granted to Zoe, Ethan, Gabe and Bea. Nothing for Jemima, his other daughter, though. Zilch. In death, as in life, she had been airbrushed from the picture. It didn't sit comfortably with Dan, but what was he supposed to do? To distract himself from this conscience wrestling, he phoned Rosemary and assured her that he would go over and look at her burglar alarm. He was about to head off when there was a sudden thud at the window. Swinging round, he was just in time to see the shape of a medium-sized bird, a blackbird perhaps, or the starling he'd seen the other day, batter itself against the glass and drop from view. Oh, God. It happened sometimes, birds mistaking windows for air, but there was still something horrible about the soft, meaty thump of flesh meeting glass. He hurried over to peer through the window, but couldn't see the bird anywhere on the ground below. Presumably, it had managed to swerve dazedly around and back up into the blue, stunned but somehow aloft. Hopefully he could do the same, he thought, leaving the room. Oh, thank goodness. You're so clever. I didn't even think about the battery. I was convinced the alarm was flashing because someone was in my flat. A burglar, I mean. Rosemary gave a small self-deprecating laugh, but her demeanour was subdued. I was scared. Over on Everlake Road, it had taken Dan a matter of minutes to remove the dying battery from Rosemary's burglar alarm, nip out to the nearest corner shop and buy a replacement, then reattach the device to her wall. Switching it on to be rewarded by a steady green light rather than a flashing red one, Dan felt something of a fraud to have Rosemary's praise heaped on him when the job had been so straightforward. "No trouble at all," he told her, returning the screwdriver to Patrick's toolbox and fastening its clasp. Then, perhaps with more rashness than was wise, he added, "Any more problems, let me know." "Oh, I will. You are good to me, Daniel. A very kind-hearted young man." She beamed at him. Dressed in a Victorian-style blouse with high collars and tiny pearl buttons, plus a tweedy skirt, she resembled some sort of excellent lady detective from the 1920s. Dan found himself wondering what she'd done for a living when younger. A teacher? A no-nonsense matron? "It's no trouble," he repeated weakly, with the polite sort of smile he'd always used for aunties and friends of his mum, although he wished she hadn't called him kind-hearted. What with keeping secrets from Zoe and his apparent inability to make a decision about Lydia, he didn't feel at all kind right now. "And it's no trouble for me to put the kettle on," she replied. "Tea or coffee?" He relented because it seemed almost impossible not to, but also because he was starting to feel fond of her. Patrick might have found her annoying, but it was obvious that Rosemary was pretty lonely at the end of the day. Lonely and rather endearing. "Coffee, please," he said. As he followed her through to the small, gleaming kitchen, Rosemary came to a sudden stop. A magnificently fluffy ginger tomcat was lounging on the table, licking a paw with a leisurely air. "He's not mine," Rosemary said, hurrying towards the table. "Come on, Desmond, what are you doing here? Off you go now, off!" The cat, Desmond, ignored her until she clapped her hands at him. Only then, with a contemptuous glare over one beefy shoulder, did he leap from his perch onto the windowsill, squeeze his considerable girth through the open window, and saunter out onto the fire escape. "Naughty boy," Rosemary said unconvincingly. Dan chose to pretend he hadn't noticed the saucer of half-eaten cat food on the floor by the wall. He glossed over the fact that Rosemary had given the cat a name, and that a cushion on one of the kitchen chairs was coated in quite a lot of ginger fur. He was pretty sure Patrick's rental agreements all stipulated that pets were not allowed, but he couldn't summon up the energy to get into a discussion about it. Besides, he had no problem with cats. "These things happen," he assured her, thinking about Harvey, the over-friendly tabby that had repeatedly treated as an invitation any open door or window of the Wandsworth flat that he and Rebecca had shared. Harvey would stroll in as if he was a resident there too, friendly and purring, butting his soft head against your legs. Rosemary busied herself making drinks and arranging a Jenga of sugar-sprinkled shortbread on a plate. Dan's gaze was drawn to the photos on the fridge, mostly fashion pictures, rather unexpectedly, although there was also a photo of a middle-aged couple pinned up with a flamingo-shaped magnet. "Are these your children?" he asked, peering closer. "No," she said without turning round. "I don't have children. That's Alan, my nephew, and his wife, Maureen." From where Dan was sitting, he could see that Alan and Maureen were probably in their early 50s and smartly dressed. Alan wore a large, expensive-looking watch on his wrist and a smug expression. Maureen sported a bright pink and orange flowered dress and a tight perm, and was smirking as she sipped a cocktail through a straw. Dan knew you shouldn't judge on appearance, but all the same, he didn't find himself warming to the pair. "Nice," he said, as she set 2 coffee cups on the table and gestured at him to sit down. "Are they local?" "They're in Richmond," she said, offering him the shortbread. "Ah, that's handy." Handy for Dan, too. If Rosemary could start ringing up smug Alan rather than him every time she was worried about her burglar alarm or squeaky floorboards. But maybe her nephew was the type who'd sooner jerk a fat thumb in another person's direction and pass the buck. Landlord's job, ain't it? He imagined the man in the photo saying. Well, yes, I suppose so. Although they're very busy. Always very busy. I've said to them, the door's always open. I do love a visitor. But they have so many friends, and Alan's got all these business trips and... Her voice faltered for the first time, and Dan felt sorry for her. Also kind of vindicated for reading the photos correctly. That's a shame, he said, so that she didn't have to finish the sentence. Clearly, smug Alan and smirking Maureen couldn't be bothered to make time for Alan's lonely old aunt. His own relative. And yet... Dan grimaced. And yet, wouldn't he be doing the exact same thing if he took Lydia at her word and blanked her and Jemima? They were his relatives too, like it or not. Jemima was his niece. His expression must have changed because Rosemary squinted at him across the table. Everything all right, dear? He hesitated. Not really, he admitted. You can tell me, she said, and for a moment he was almost tempted to blurt out the whole tale. That bad-tempered last night in Hammersmith, Patrick's shocking death, his own determination to make everything right, the discovery of Lydia. Well, he shook his head. It's a long story. Family stuff, you know. I see, she said, her eyes softening. They were very blue, he noticed. The blue of Wedgwood plates. Despite everything, he felt himself unbending. Maybe she would be a good person to talk to. Someone objective, wise even. And who else could he tell his secrets to? Well, he said again, still undecided. Then the window rattled, and there was Desmond barging his bulky way back inside again, as if refusing to put up with his banishment for a second longer. Manoeuvring onto the windowsill, he dropped to the kitchen floor and walked straight over to the food bowl with an unmistakable swagger of ownership. Oh, Desmond! Rosemary's face became suffused with guilt as the cat began daintily licking the jelly from the chunks of meat. Now, you mustn't think he's mine, she gabbled, not quite able to meet Dan's eye. I did put a bit of food out for him this morning because he was wailing so plaintively I thought my heart would break, but... It's fine, said Dan. Cats were total bullshitters in his opinion. Wailing plaintively, indeed, he thought. This one had spotted a sucker all right. Honestly, I don't mind, as long as he's not ripping up the furniture or anything. Goodness, no, absolutely not. I would forbid any behaviour like that in an instant, Rosemary assured him. Her lower lip wobbled momentarily. Then she reached across the table and patted Dan's hand. Thank you, darling. It's just nice to have someone to love, isn't it? Something, I should say. She gazed fondly at the cat. I've been leaving my window open so that he can come and go, and I'm always pleased to see him, she added in a rush of confession. Dan found himself thinking hard as she went over to make a fuss of the creature. Life was short, too short to be a wanker to people. Whatever Lydia might have said, he wanted to do the right thing. He didn't want to be like Alan, the ignorant nephew who was content to forget about his lonely aunt. He didn't want to be like Patrick either, and whitewash inconvenient relatives out of his life with excuses or money. You were about to tell me something, I think, Rosemary said, straightening up once more. That blue gaze of hers was so direct it was hard to look away. Let me guess. Is it girl trouble? Somebody breaking your heart? But Dan, having made his decision, was keen to get going. Cramming a last piece of shortbread into his mouth, he rose to his feet. It's not girl trouble, he confirmed. Well, it kind of was, he supposed. But the story was far too complicated to wade into now. I think I've just worked it out for myself anyway. Thanks all the same. And then he said goodbye and left, blinking a little as he stepped outside into the light. Chapter 18. So, what are we pricing these at, John? Asked Lydia, kneeling on the floor of the shop, carefully unpacking some bubble-wrapped ceramic hares to put on the shelves. They were beautiful objects, smooth and weighty, about the size of a butternut squash, and each one perfectly unique, with their comically long ears and expressive large eyes. Jonathan was standing at the card carousel, slotting in a bunch of greetings cards. Bon voyage. Good luck with your exams. New baby boy, they exclaimed. 200 quid, he said, glancing over his shoulder at her. 200? Seriously? Lydia rocked back onto her haunches, goggling from her boss back to the hair in her hands, then gripping it a little tighter now that she knew how much it was worth. 200 quid. Honestly, some people had more money than sense. She would rather run down the street without a bra on than shell out 200 quid for a posh ornament. What? You don't think you can sell any at that price? He raised an eyebrow at her, competitive as ever. Tall and broad, with close-cropped salt and pepper hair, Jonathan had become Eleanor's best friend practically the day they met, working in a West End theatre together, making costumes and props. Tenner says I shift more of them than you do. Lydia snorted. You're on, she replied. In fact, I'm going to put one in the window now, and if anyone comes in and asks about it, we'll be counting that as my sale. Okay? He laughed. That's my girl, he said. It was the first Monday of the school holidays, and Lydia had organised a complicated childcare swap system with Bridget over the fortnight, calling in a couple of days' help from her dad too, in order to make up the hours here and there. Thank goodness for the safety net of friends and family, but all the same, sometimes the net beneath her felt threadbare and liable to fray. It would only take one snag, one tiny break, and the whole thing would unravel, leaving them falling to the ground. Lydia had booked 4 days off next week, but would be looking after Bridget's son during that time, which sometimes felt harder work than being in the shop. So be it. This was how life went, and women managed, propping one another up as best they could. Clambering into the window, she fiddled around with the display to find the optimum place for the hair. She had rearranged the stock there the week before for an Easter theme, building a set with old wooden crates filled with paper straw and putting together a clutch of felted chickens, a set of gorgeous watercolours of spring flowers, and some smooth, cold marble eggs in shades of rust, pewter and jet. Mina, one of their nicest artists, had made a batch of delicate ceramic flowers too, which Lydia had arranged in a large spotty jug. With a few pastel-toned cushions and a fringed throw in a soft heathery shade, it all looked very appealing, even if she said so herself. She moved a couple of striped earthenware pots from a central crate and positioned the hair there instead. Perfect. The April sun shone warm and bright through the window as she rearranged the felted chickens into a line to better show them off. There. But then, crouched in the window just as she was about to stand up and clamber out again, she saw someone approaching the shop and her heart gave an uncomfortable thump. Oh gosh, that wasn't Patrick's brother again, was it? Shit, she muttered under her breath. It was. It was actually him, walking down the street, peering at the shop fronts as if hunting for one in particular. A particular person, even. It must be a huge coincidence, surely, because he couldn't be looking for her, could he? By now he was almost at the shop and she was still crouching there, frozen awkwardly as his gaze fell upon her. Then his face cleared and he gave her a tentative smile. He was looking for her. But why? What now? "Everything all right?" asked Jonathan. No. "Yeah," she said. "Well, I'm not sure, actually." Her instinct was to hide behind one of the crates, but it was too late for that, far too late. The shop bell was jingling with his arrival, and so she had to deal with the embarrassment of climbing out of the window and jumping back onto the shop floor in front of him, brushing fake straw off her indigo shirt dress. Oh Lord, it was all over her tights as well, she realised, plucking frantically at herself. This definitely wasn't the talk to my lawyer look she'd been able to present to him the other day. "Hello there," Jonathan said to Dan, professional as ever. "Hello," Lydia added, trying to sound calm. She forced herself to look at him. Just an inch shorter than Patrick, she reckoned, narrower shoulders. A paler, dilute version of Patrick's smouldering dark handsomeness. "I got the looks, he got the brains," Patrick joked again in her head, and she swallowed hard. The problem with brainy people was that they sometimes tripped you up, outsmarted you when you least expected it. "And what brings you into our shop?" she asked, unable to help drawing herself a little taller in the hope of taking up more space. "Tell me this is not some spooky random coincidence." Hi," Dan said, with a polite nod in Jonathan's direction. "It's not a spooky random coincidence," he confirmed, turning back towards Lydia. "I nicked your business card from Zoe's fridge. Thought I would pay a visit rather than try and do this on the phone." This? What was this? "Sounds ominous," she said, feeling alarmed. "Not at all," he replied, holding up his hands as if to show her he wasn't carrying any weapons. Which was marginally reassuring, but only just. "Are you due a lunch break around now, by any chance?" he went on. "Maybe we could go to a cafe. Have a chat." She hesitated, then glanced over at Jonathan, who shrugged. "Up to you," he said, his gaze flicking from Lydia back to Dan. She could tell her boss was wildly curious to find out what this was about. Lydia felt as if she had no choice. "Okay," she said wearily. "What's the plan?" "Pub?" Dan suggested, gesturing down the road. Oh God, whatever he wanted to say to her was serious enough that he needed alcohol to get through it. She gave a nervous smile. "Sounds good to me," she lied. "So," Dan began, once they were sitting down together in the nearest pub with a lunch menu each. A melancholy Rod Stewart ballad drifted from the speakers, and he found himself wishing he'd given slightly more thought to their meeting venue than simply having steered her this way on impulse. There was a neglected air about the place. The carpet was threadbare in patches. The table between them looked greasy, with a discarded sugar wrapper in the centre, and the padded blue bench they were sitting on had a small tear in its fabric that revealed foam beneath, the colour of an overripe banana. With a potentially tricky conversation bearing down on him, Dan felt unable to concentrate on the list of sandwiches and light bites, and abandoned the laminated menu. "Listen, I'm sorry to turn up out of the blue like this," he went on. "But I've been thinking." There was an understatement. Ever since he had stumbled upon the existence of Lydia and her daughter, the knowledge of them had been a lit match in his hand. A lit match that had the capacity to burn a lot of stuff down. Her face was polite, but anxious too, probably wishing he hadn't come barging back into her life, let alone her shop. She was wearing a belted purple-blue dress and knee-high rust-coloured boots that creaked when she crossed her legs. Her hair was thick and brown, as shiny as a conker as it fell around her face. "Concentrate, Dan," he reminded himself. Basically, the long and the short of it is, I don't think it's fair, he went on, picking up a creased beer mat and spinning it around, just to give his fingers something to do. Even though you said you don't want Patrick's money and all the rest of it, that doesn't sit right with me. I kind of think you should still have it. Right, she said, gazing steadily at him. You could tell she was waiting for the but to follow. Yeah, his next words came out in a rush. Because his other kids have been looked after financially, like massively looked after. Big lump sums waiting for them when they're 18. Which is quite right, you know, they've lost their father and all, but... He hesitated, then went on. But your daughter should be looked after like that too. She was his child as well. And I know you said you didn't need the money now, and I totally respect that, if you really feel that way. But you could always put the monthly payments into a trust fund for her, or something. Start a savings account for when she's older, in case she wants to go off to uni or whatever. What do you think? His pulse raced as he waited for her to respond. He tried not to think about Zoe and how her face would collapse if she ever got to hear about this conversation. Was it even legal, what he was proposing? Patrick's business account was still active, as Zoe was one of the company directors and co-signatories. And Dan had reasoned to himself that he wasn't doing anything, as much as not doing it. Not cancelling the standing order, which, now he came to think about it, he probably wouldn't have permission to cancel anyway. So maybe the status quo was best for everyone. Christ, he hoped so. God, said Lydia, looking dazed. Her eyes glistened with emotion. Are you serious? I'm serious, he replied. I feel bad about this. Patrick's my brother, was my brother, but it sounds as if he was a bit of a shit to you. And look, at the end of the day, your daughter is my niece, like you said. We're family, sort of. Lydia nodded. Her lips were pressed so tightly together, the colour blanched from them momentarily. She drummed her fingers on the table and Dan's eye was caught by a silver ring she was wearing, which looked like a tiny Viking helmet. What about... She stumbled over the words. His wife. I can't imagine she's very happy about this. Ah, yes. She doesn't know, admitted Dan. She's had such a rough time lately, I don't think it would be a great idea to tell her just yet. He was saying these words as if they came from a place of thoughtfulness, but he knew that it was largely down to sheer cowardice. I don't want to deceive her, but on balance, it might be best if I keep stum and let the payments continue as before. He pulled a face, feeling conflicted. Had he just nominated himself for worst brother-in-law ever? The other day when Zoe had talked about reimbursing Dan from the business account, he'd managed to dissuade her, but this wasn't sustainable, he knew. There would come a time when Zoe wanted to take over from Dan and became the one sorting through statements for the accountant. How could he protect her from finding out about Lydia then? He'd have to invent some maintenance company maybe, then switch the direct debit to come from his own account. God, it was all so complicated. There were so many variables. Lydia exhaled as if she had been holding her breath. Thank you, she said. I'm not quite sure what to say other than thank you. That's really decent of you. He looked down at the table, not feeling very decent at all. Wanting to be fair to Lydia was one thing, but the business account was now Zoe's money, he reminded himself. Wasn't it actually pretty schmucky of him to turn a blind eye to the maintenance payments? Pretty weak. Yet what else could he do without alerting Zoe to the existence of these new family members? Lydia was still talking, the colour returning to her face. To be honest, I'd been regretting acting so high and mighty last time we met, telling you to shove the money and all that. It's not as if I'm rolling in this stuff. All the same, what you're proposing, I don't want to come between you and your sister-in-law or cause any trouble. This was welcome news, at least. I don't want to cause trouble either, he said, but hopefully she won't find out. Not immediately, anyway. I can sign off the accounts and pretend I never poked my nose into them. I know it's not the ideal solution, but... They exchanged a shaky smile across the table. Well, thank you, again, she said. No problem. Dan hoped these words would turn out to be accurate. And obviously, if there's ever anything I can do for you or Jemima, please say. He was still fiddling with the beer mat, he realised, putting it down abruptly. Since Patrick died, I've been looking after his kids more than before, and... He shrugged, feeling bashful. Well, I don't have children myself, and I've actually really enjoyed getting to know them a bit better. That's nice, she said, her eyes crinkling at the edges. You and Patrick, were you close? Sort of, in that big brother, little brother way, I guess, he replied. I always looked up to him. He did everything first, whereas I was forever trying to catch up. But yeah, we did get on, most of the time. His face froze, remembering their last terrible argument, and he went on quickly. We were pretty different, but it was always just the two of us, growing up. Now I'm the only child, and it feels really odd. I bet, she said. I always wanted a brother. I wouldn't have minded a sister, for that matter. Being an only child is a bit rubbish sometimes. Another tentative smile was exchanged. Are you from round here? He asked, suddenly interested in finding out about her. You sound very West London, not that that's a bad thing. I grew up in Hammersmith myself. South Acton, she replied. She had delicate freckles, he noticed, carefully dotted across the bridge of her nose. Let me guess, you were one of the William Morris boys. He laughed in surprise. Got it in one. Did you go there? No, worse luck. I went to a dump in Ealing, but my friend Bridget was madly in love with a boy from William Morris, so we ended up going to a lot of parties with sixth formers from there. She rolled her eyes. Those were the days, eh? Wild and irresponsible. We thought we knew it all, he agreed. I was going to be a pop star, for about 5 minutes anyway. Had the hair gel and everything. She burst out laughing. Seriously? I was going to be a fashion designer. I could have made you some cool outfits. That must have been where I went wrong, he said. My outfits were definitely not cool enough. He glanced down at his faded blue grandad shirt and jeans. Still aren't, for that matter. Damn it. They seemed to have arrived at a friendlier footing, as if by swapping teenage stories the armour had dropped a fraction from their bodies. Do you still have family locally? Lydia asked after a moment. My parents are over in Brentford, he said. I've been trying to pop in when I can, he added. This was a bit of an exaggeration, but he was planning to go back again this week, so it wasn't a complete lie. He wanted to impress her, he realised in the next moment, with a jolt of self-awareness, or at least beef up the evidence that he was a good guy. I bet they appreciate that, she said, eyes soft. I can't imagine how tough it must be for all of you. Dealing with the loss, I mean. He nodded. It keeps taking me by surprise, he admitted. And not a good surprise either. Like going over to Mum's house, I think of him all the time. Whenever I walk past the pub where we spent the last evening of his life, I'm back there, remembering it. Even seeing the dead tree in my garden brings him to mind. A dead tree? Why, did he kill it or something? No, he was supposed to be helping me cut it down and get rid of it the day after. The rest of the sentence failed Dan unexpectedly, and he stared down at the maroon carpet trying to find the words. The morning that he He shook his head, tongue-tied. "We were supposed to be cutting it down together," he said eventually. She seemed to understand. "And you don't feel you can now?" "I've got some kind of block about it," he mumbled, hoping she wouldn't find him too weird. He had already surprised himself by being far more open with her emotionally than he would have been if the two of them had met a few months earlier. Grief seemed to have left him raw, scraping off a topmost layer that usually protected him from exposing his feelings with this much honesty. "Anyway," he grabbed a menu as a distraction. "I'm supposed to be getting you lunch here. What would you like? And should we be concerned about ordering food from a place that can't spell potato?" She peered at the other menu. "I've always loved a jacket spud with an actual toe," she remarked. "But I'm game to risk my life, if you are." He laughed again. Despite everything, there was something so likeable about her. So warm. "Bring it on," he said. Chapter 19. On Wednesday, Dan had arranged a day out with Ethan, suggesting an art walk from the Greenwich Peninsula over the Thames and up into Queen Elizabeth Park that featured all sorts of interesting-looking outdoor artworks. It was a blustery day, with gusts of wind strong enough to blow a seagull off course. But the sky was bright and clear, and the Thames was Air Force blue when they arrived in Greenwich. As soon as they caught sight of the first piece on the trail, a huge steel construction that resembled an inverted electricity pylon, nosediving to the ground, Ethan's face lit up, and Dan knew he'd backed a winner. "Whoa," the boy marvelled, staring at the vast sculpture in awe. How do they even keep this thing up? It was a serious piece of engineering, no doubt about it. With the gleaming towers of the Isle of Dogs in the distance, and the rumble of building works around the O2 Arena ever present, the sculpture felt outlandish and witty, a piece of crash-landed nonsense amid so much industry. "It's called A Bullet from a Shooting Star," Dan read from his phone. "And it weighs 15 tons. And get this, it took 120 tons of concrete and foundations going 25 metres deep to anchor it in place. Bloody hell." They gazed at it together, wowed. "I love it," said Ethan, taking photos from different angles. "Even if the stuff we're making at Sculpt Shed seems like totally lame now." "It's great," Dan agreed. "Ridiculously great. And all this fencing around it makes it feel like something from outer space that's dangerous to get close to. Watch out for aliens. You never know when one might be creeping up behind you." "Uncle Dan!" Ethan yelped, laughing, as Dan made a sudden grab for him. "Take me to your leader," Dan droned in his best alien's voice. Further around the peninsula, they passed an artwork that was, effectively, a slice of a rusting sand dredger, resting in the shallow waters of the Thames, with the water and wind passing freely through the open lower deck. The blank-faced skyscrapers that glinted on the other side of the river made the dredger seem like a relic from the past, industrial and derelict compared to the moneyed towers beyond. "Cool," breathed Ethan, peering over the railings. "It's like one of those cross-section diagrams. Dad would have loved this," he added wistfully. "He loved poking around old docks and shipyards, didn't he?" "He did," agreed Dan. They stared down at the river together, the wind tugging at their jackets and hair, and Dan tried not to think about his brother's lifeless body in the water, tossed about by the current. "Let's keep going," he said, repressing a shiver. They walked on around the O2 Arena, with the sticky-looking mudflats to their left and the cable cars crossing the river ahead of them. Next on the art trail was a faintly disturbing bronze sculpture of twisted mannequin limbs on a massive scale. "Whoa," was Ethan's response. And then they came to Anthony Gormley's enormous quantum cloud piece set on a platform a small distance out in the water. The sculpture initially reminded Dan of a murmuration, a huge gathering of birds in the sky, although as they drew closer he changed his mind, deciding it was more reminiscent of a metal dandelion clock with a man's figure visible within. It reminds me of static on a screen, Ethan decided, with someone trapped inside. There's something eerie about it, Dan agreed. Apparently, it questions the reality of the self to the world and evokes the quantum age, suggesting an unstable relationship between energy and mass. Ethan read from a description he had found online. Exactly what I was about to say, Dan replied. They stood staring at it for a while, the wind rustling through the rushes at the edge of the river. Although right now, I've got to say, my stomach is suggesting an unstable relationship between hunger and lunch. Shall we find somewhere to eat? Over packets of sandwiches, sitting on a bench nearby, Ethan caught Dan up with the news from his world. So far, during the holidays, he'd been to the cinema with a couple of mates. Zoe had taken him and his siblings bowling and to a climbing wall, and they'd been over to see Dan's parents for Sunday lunch. Dan, who had become finely tuned to the atmosphere in his brother's family, like a human seismometer alert for emotional tremors, felt cautiously satisfied. That all sounded pretty good, he reckoned. Zoe was getting everyone out and about. They were having fun together rather than moping around. Like a normal family, in fact. News delivered, Ethan became distracted as a series of beeps sounded from his phone, and he peered down at it, reading messages and laughing softly. Who are you chatting to? Dan asked after a minute. When it appeared, he had been forsaken in favour of some digital bants. Oh, sorry, Uncle Dan. Just a friend, Ethan said, his thumbs a blur of movement as he fired off a reply. There was something joyful and open about his face as he read another message and laughed again. I sent him some photos I took earlier and we're chatting about them. Dan gazed out at the Gormley sculpture again as his nephew caught up on his social life. From this angle, you couldn't see the man within the cloud of shapes anymore. There was the strange conundrum of it being simultaneously invisible, yet there. Just like Lydia had been until now, he reflected, then pulled a face at the way his mind had leapt so quickly back to her. In truth, though, he had thought about her a lot since their pub lunch. Things had taken a turn for the confusing, as he and Lydia had chatted more and he'd realised that, well, if he was honest with himself, he'd realised that he liked her. Okay, fancied her a bit too. Not that anything could or would ever happen between them, when she and Patrick had already had a relationship and there was this whole minefield of a backstory looming large. It was unthinkable. Anyway, wasn't there something a bit pathetic about the idea of latching onto Patrick's ex, as if he was trying to prove a point or something? Was he trying to prove a point? Was this his lame attempt at retribution after what Patrick had told him during their last evening together? Don't think about that, Dan. He was not thinking about that. Oh God, but suddenly it was impossible to think about anything coherently, to order his thoughts in any kind of sensible format. All he knew was that he had enjoyed talking to Lydia, that she was pretty and funny, that she had tiny beautiful freckles and noisy boots and long graceful fingers. Even her ears were sweet, he had noticed at one point, when she tucked her hair behind them, like small perfect shells. But he shouldn't be noticing these things at all, he reminded himself in anguish. He must not think of her in any other way than, Uncle Dan! I said, can I open the crisps now? Yes, sure. God, he had totally zoned out just then. Sorry, I was miles away. I could tell. I should have nicked your Maltesers, Ethan said. He shoved a handful of crisps in his mouth and crunched. Dad always used to say, whenever I looked like that, "What's her name then?" Dan nearly choked on his sandwich. Had he been that obvious? "Well," he blustered, but Ethan was still talking. "I didn't have the heart to tell him I preferred boys," he said with a brittle laugh. "Good old Dad, always there with the assumptions." Dan struggled to swallow the half-chewed bread in his mouth. Whoa, had he heard that correctly? Had Ethan just coolly dropped a gigantic coming-out bomb into the conversation? Bloody hell. He thought frantically, knowing that whatever he said next had to be exactly right, supportive and accepting and loving. He felt a flush of pride too. Ethan trusted him, he realised. He trusted him with this big, important piece of news. "Do you think your dad knew how you felt?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "About preferring boys, I mean." He risked a glance at his nephew's face to see that Ethan was staring out at the river, looking remarkably untroubled. "Nah," he replied, the wind lifting a lock of his gingery hair, then dropping it again. "Mum knows, but I asked her not to tell him. He would have been disappointed in me, I reckon." There was just the slightest tension around his jaw to give away the fact that Ethan was not quite as nonchalant as he aimed to appear. Dan ached to hug him. He actually felt a pain in his own chest. Should he hug him? "He might have been surprised," he said, gently instead. He didn't want the hug to stop the conversation before it had run its course, and it might have taken him a bit of time to get his head round the idea. But I know he wouldn't have been disappointed in you. Definitely not. He was proud of you, Ethan made a scoffing noise in his throat before attacking the crisp packet once more. "Not sure about that," he muttered. "He was your dad. He loved you," Dan said. Whatever unthinking macho crap Patrick might have come out with about classical music being gay, he was not a complete dinosaur when it came to love and all its variations. "Okay." He loved you so much and would have carried on loving you whatever you told him about yourself. 100%. Licking the salt off his fingers, Ethan folded the empty crisp packet into a neat triangle. He still didn't look wholly convinced. "Maybe," he said with a shrug. There was silence for a moment, bar the rushing of the wind and the tinny clatter of an empty Red Bull can that went bouncing along in front of them. "Remember the first time I picked you up from Sculpt Shed and you asked me about what happened? The last night I saw your dad," Dan said. "And you were quite fierce with me because you'd overheard your mum saying stuff. And you asked me outright, was it my fault that he died?" Ethan looked down at the ground. "Yeah, sorry about that," he said gruffly. No need to apologise," Dan put in. "I'm not saying it to make you feel bad. It was more that when you rounded on me like that, and it was pretty brave of you to do so, by the way, I sat there thinking how proud your dad would be of you, for taking it up with me, for daring to ask that question. Well, genuinely, I swear, I thought how proud he would be if he could see you fight in his corner, tackling a difficult conversation on his behalf." He glanced across at his nephew again, deciding that this was the right moment to throw an arm round his shoulders. "There. And if you'd told him what you've just told me, he'd have recognised that took guts too. No doubt about it." They sat there for a few seconds together, gazing out at the sludgy Thames and the big sky and glittering skyscrapers. And Dan thought to himself, yes, he was pretty sure that had gone okay. He was pretty sure he had said the right thing. Until Ethan wriggled out from under him, saying, Okay, this has gone weird. Shall I open the Maltesers now? Dan laughed. Yeah, I reckon. Then we should get going. Next stop, the cable car. I've never been on it before, have you? He grinned, feeling a burst of boyish excitement at the prospect. Maybe he wasn't doing all of this from the goodness of his heart. Walking along together, chatting about cable cars and ferries and boats, it was almost as if their earlier conversation hadn't happened. But it had, and it felt special. Like Ethan had trusted him with something really precious. Dan hugged it to himself for the rest of the day. Chapter 20. Hey Dan, read the back of the postcard. The front showed a manky-looking alpaca, or llama, amidst tufty grass with mountains in the background. Bolivia is awesome. Went to Salar de Uyuni, tons of flamingos and mad cacti, soaked in hot springs under moonlit sky necking Singani, white grape brandy, lethal. Off to a national park somewhere tomorrow. Apparently you can go sandboarding and see jaguars. Love, Tiggy. Kiss. It was hard to read the postcard without a stab of envy, but Dan contented himself with the fact that, as the Easter holidays progressed, entries on the Patrick spreadsheet were accumulating thick and fast. He dealt with a dodgy radiator and a broken light fitting for a couple of the tenants, and was delighted to hear there had already been several viewings on the Whitecliff Road flat that he'd spent so long painting. No takers yet, but there's lots of interest, the estate agent oozed. After the success of the art trail with Ethan, he'd taken B for a bike ride the very next day, and promised Gabe that he would sort out another skateboarding session soon. Solo this time. He also offered to babysit for Zoe on Friday night, for which she eagerly thanked him. The goals he had set himself, the list of Patrick's best qualities he had drawn up, great dad, loving husband, successful businessman, Dan was able to look at them now and think, yes, he was filling the gap. He was stepping into the absence and being there when it counted. Not such a loser after all, he told himself with a nod of satisfaction. In short, he was feeling, dare he say it, pretty pleased with his own efforts as he parked outside his parents' house on Thursday afternoon, ready for another shot at the casual drop-in. Caring son? Tick. This time he had come prepared with a bunch of flowers for his mum, a book he was lending his dad, and a load of photos on his phone to show them, of Bea on her bike from earlier on. She and he had spent quite some time beforehand decorating said bike to look like a unicorn, and she had pedalled along shouting, "Fly, Mirabelle, fly!" which had been outrageously cute. He couldn't help noticing people smiling and pointing out the unicorn bike, plus its adorable rider, to one another. But then he found himself thinking about Jemima, Lydia's daughter. Was she a unicorn lover too, with a similarly rich imaginary interior life? Did she and Lydia go out for bike rides together? Was she exuberant like Bea, or a more introverted type like Ethan? The questions persisted all morning with no easy answers. Should he phone Lydia again, he wondered. Ask if he could meet Jemima. Maybe he could dig out some photos of Patrick for her, put a potted biography together, just so that when in the future Jemima asked, as she was sure to do, some serious questions about her dad, Lydia had something to show her. Besides, it would be an excuse to contact her once more, he thought eagerly, before remembering Zoe and immediately feeling disloyal. He sighed, knowing it would be a huge betrayal, of her and his own brother as well. What was he getting himself into here? Whose side was he on anyway? And yet doing nothing didn't seem an option either. It felt like the coward's way out. Arriving at his parents' house, he was distracted from the dilemma when he noticed that the picture he hated of him and Patrick had been moved back to centre stage in the display once more. He slid it behind a large photo of the grandchildren while Liz went to put the flowers he'd brought in water, then sat there in the overheated living room being the dutiful son while she told him her news. He'd forgotten how long it could take her to tell a fairly boring story about some fairly boring people that he had never met, nor had any inclination to meet. But he did a passable job of looking interested and engaged all the same. Or so he thought, anyway. But he must have drifted off for a moment or two, because suddenly she flung her hands up, exclaiming, "You're not listening to a word I'm saying, are you?" "I am," he protested. "I know you're not, because I just told you that Arthur next door got engaged to a golden retriever and you said, 'That's nice.'" She folded her arms across her chest, eyeing him suspiciously. Liz Shepherd had always had a laser-like gaze, able to spot from a mile away the telling signs that a son was bunking off school, not eating his vegetables, or keeping something from her. "He's not engaged to anyone, by the way, least of all a dog," she clarified. "But now I'm wondering what's going on with you up there." She tapped the side of her head and gave him her most penetrating look. She wasn't quite shining a bright torch into his eyes, but she might as well have been. "Go on, let's hear it. What's on your mind?" "Mum, it's nothing." He really needed to work on his poker face. "Is it a girl?" "Is it? Only I was saying to your dad the other night, it would be nice if you could find someone new. Move on from Rebecca, once and for all." Then her lips clamped together with a guilty expression, as if she had spoken out of turn. "What?" asked Dan. "Why are you looking like that?" "Ah." Liz and Derek Shepherd had been together since they were 16, and were of the generation that stubbornly insisted marriage was for life, however disappointing the relationship might turn out to be. She had never said as much, but Dan knew that she'd been deeply troubled by his divorce, seeing it as a failure of catastrophic proportions. "Well now." "Mum, just say it. What's happened?" Liz shifted slightly in her seat, folding her hands in her lap. "I bumped into her dad on the high street last week, who told me she's having a baby." There was a moment of silence as Dan remembered Rebecca's last cryptic post on Facebook. Big day tomorrow. Presumably she'd been going for a scan or something, not a job interview. He swallowed. A baby. His stomach churned. How could she? He thought. How could she? "I don't want children," she had told him the last time he'd broached the subject, some years after Gabe's birth. In fact, it must have been when Patrick announced that he and Zoe were expecting baby number 3, when Dan's feelings about fatherhood had become a permanent ache. It turned out that Rebecca hadn't changed her mind on motherhood, though, far from it. "I just don't want to be a mum," she'd said. "Sorry, Dan, but I think it looks really boring, to be honest, and bloody hard work." Dan had accepted her decision. You couldn't force someone you loved to have a child they didn't want, after all. But in private had felt devastated. Because seeing Patrick and Zoe with their children didn't look boring at all to him. It looked really lovely, joyful, meaningful. "Must be strange for you," his mum said, her forensic stare now one of concern. Strange. That was one word for it. Cheated. There was another. So maybe Rebecca had wanted kids all along, only not with him. Having a baby with hunky Rory was a far more appealing prospect, obviously. "Yes," he managed to croak, trying not to show how much it hurt. "Oh well, nothing to do with me anymore." She wasn't a touchy-feely sort of mum, Liz. She'd always been more inclined to whack her boys with a tea towel growing up, rather than shower them with displays of affection. But she reached over now and squeezed his hand, which was about as sentimental as she ever got. "There's someone much better out there for you," she said. "I know it, Daniel. You're a good lad. I've always said so. Our family has gone through a terrible time lately, but there are better days ahead. You wait. We'll get there, eh? We will, he said, comforted by her uncharacteristic tenderness. Then he changed the subject. Let me show you some photos of Bea before I forget, he said, pulling out his phone. Seeing her face soften with fondness and love as she scrolled through the pictures, it dawned on him belatedly that she and his dad also stood to be greatly affected by the discovery of Lydia and Jemima. This was another grandchild for them to dote on, another piece of Patrick for them to love. Surely they'd want to know her, to fold her into the family. Wouldn't it be wrong of him to deny them this? He stared down at his knees, his thoughts in a tangle. Living with his secrets felt like being trapped inside a lie, betraying people he loved. But what was he supposed to do? So, whatever he says to the contrary, Gabe has to be in bed, lights out, the works, by 9 o'clock at the absolute latest, okay? Otherwise he'll be vile tomorrow, and we'll all know about it. I am deeply insulted, said the vile one, who was trying to balance a tennis ball on his head across the room. Don't worry, I have my cattle prod, said Dan. I'll make sure he gets enough beauty sleep. Hey, grumbled Gabe as the tennis ball fell off his head and rolled along the carpet. I don't need beauty sleep, actually. Yuck. Who wants to be beautiful? Ugly sleep, then, said Zoe, pulling a face at Dan. She was having a rare girls' night out with her friends and staying over at Claire's, which she'd been looking forward to ever since Dan had offered his babysitting services. Putting on a proper face of makeup and spritzing herself with perfume had been surprisingly uplifting. But now that she was all dressed up and about to leave, she was having nervous flutters about the whole idea. There was a part of her that was desperate to drink cocktails and strut her stuff on a sticky dance floor, just let go and leave her grief at the door for one night. But there was a different part of her that was scared about doing so. Scared to be out in the bright lights, surrounded by people drunkenly having fun, when she was this bruised and damaged version of her old self, vulnerable to everything. Besides, what sort of a look was it for a grieving widow to be dancing the night away? What did it say to the rest of the world? That she didn't care? She was dreading bumping into one of the school mums, for instance, and having it whispered around the playground that she was a heartless bitch. Earlier that day, she'd been back to the GP and confessed her worries aloud on this score. But Dr. Gupta had been very clear. You are still allowed to be happy, even while you're sad, she'd said firmly, looking Zoe straight in the eye. In fact, I really encourage you to find happiness whenever you can. It doesn't demean or define your grief in any way. Quite the opposite. Moments of happiness will be what get you through this time and out the other side, okay? Now then. She'd steepled her fingers together, her gaze steady. How about the therapy we discussed last time? Have you taken any steps to talk to a professional? Not yet, Zoe confessed, remembering how the booklet was still at the bottom of her handbag, where it had been stuffed 2 weeks ago. I think it would help, if you can take that step. What have you got to lose? Anything else? Dan asked now, and Zoe jerked back to the present. No. I'll be back by 10 tomorrow morning. Any problems, check with Ethan first, then ring me. Bea will hopefully stay asleep now, but if she has a bad dream, try reading her a story in a slow voice. She might wet the bed, sorry. But if it's the middle of the night, just grab a sleeping bag from the cupboard. Let me show you. Don't worry, I can manage, Dan interrupted, putting a hand on her arm as she made a move towards the stairs. Honestly, it's only a night. I'll look after them. Go and have a good time. What if there's a burglar? Called Gabe, who was now trying to roll the tennis ball along his arm. He had been practicing this all week, with the result that there had been a constant backdrop of small thudding sounds and disappointed groans coming from whichever room he happened to be in. There won't be any burglars, but if any are mad enough to try, we'll water pistol them out your window, Dan replied, which earned a delighted "cool" in response. Zoe wished she wasn't going at all now. Burglars, wet beds, overexcited children. There were too many things that could go wrong. Plus, she was already having second thoughts about her dress. It was a clingy black number that clung a bit too tightly after all the crisps she'd been eating, and she just remembered that it had a habit of riding up her thighs. Also, her roots were coming through where she hadn't been to the hairdressers lately, and what was the point? She should stay home. She wasn't ready for this. They'll be fine, Dan said, reading her expression. Go on, shoo. Go wild. Have fun and don't come back tomorrow without a storming hangover at the very least. She smiled faintly. Sod it. She was only going out with her old uni friends. They wouldn't care about her dress or her hair, she reminded herself. Also, if she ended up a mess, they would have her back, just as she'd have theirs. Okay, thank you, she said. I'll do my best. See you in the morning. Bye, boys. Be good. And then she was walking through the door with her overnight bag and breathing in the cool evening air. The streetlights were gleaming smudgily through the darkness. She could smell the top notes of amber from her perfume, and a frisson went through her suddenly at the sheer novelty of being out on her own at this time of night. It had been ages, months. She could do this, she told herself, as she clutched her bag a little tighter and set off.
This is the end of CD6. The book continues on CD7.